Welcome, everyone. This is your friend, the DN WhatIf 2.0, here with another exciting fanfiction. Today, we're diving into the story of What If Deku Had to Carry the Grief Too? If you enjoy this video, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more fanfiction content just like this. Now, let's get started with the fanfic. Shoto was a monstrous brother. Tears had not fallen while at the funeral. He felt nothing while at the funeral. Formal apologies from strangers were accepted with cold apathy, strangers who had more grief in their voices than Shoto himself could release. Fuyumi mentioned that quite a few guests were those Natsuo had known from college. Professors, friends, even people he had known from his internship at the hospital. From across the room, Shoto could see a petite girl hunched over in her seat, hiding in her hands as her shoulders quivered. Possibly Natsuo's girlfriend. Shoto had never met her. The eulogy was difficult. Fuyumi's voice was thin and shaky, like cracked glass only a hair's breadth away from shattering irreparably. She spoke about how Natsuo was dedicated to earning his graduation certificate and becoming a doctor. Shoto had already learned that about his brother, albeit recently. And then she spoke about the way he refused to accept no as an answer. How he enjoyed cooking despite not being very good, never finding time to do much of it. How he always wanted a dog, a husky, because he loved being outside during the winter and wanted someone else to play with who wasn't too tired or too busy all day. Shame weighed Shoto's head down and he stared at his hands as they tangled and untangled. A thought flickered eerily. What else do you not know about your brother? Shoto was sure that his brother's friends knew more about him than Shoto, and it ripped him apart. Rei's appearance at the funeral surprised him. She looked to be held up by the gentle hands of her caretakers, for if they left her alone, she would fall apart completely. His mother was in her own world. It was a world that Shoto wasn't sure he would be welcome in. He wanted to be in his own world, too, but he was trapped in reality, trapped under the ice. All he wanted was to take a breath, but when he did, grief filled his lungs and dragged him down ruthlessly. Knowing where the surface was impossible. Maybe there was no surface. Maybe the only thing that awaited him on the other side of the ice was an emptiness that would drive him mad. The only thing that remained was darkness, waiting patiently for Shoto to stop struggling and let go. Shoto quietly stood from his chair and stalked out of the room, offering an apologetic glance at his sister as she finished her eulogy. The look that Fuyumi gave him may have been one of the saddest things he'd ever seen. It was as if every sorrowful, heartbreaking feeling had made itself home inside his igloo of a sister. It was like she suddenly knew what it meant to die from the cold. She didn't go after him. He was glad. It was rude of him to leave, he knew, and he could feel the scrutiny following him before he turned out of view, but he didn't care. He had seen too much death. It was starting to linger on him like ash. The cool air that welcomed him outside cleared the gravel from his throat and the needles that stung his eyes. Shoto left red crescents in his palms as he collapsed onto the bench on the side of the building. His head tipped back to touch the wall. The clouds drifted above, but Shoto se in a breath when red began to stain their powder snow, growing like veins and fluttering like dust. His hair was barely white anymore. Washed in blood, it wasn't even recognizable. Shoto held back a GG. He snapped his neck down to watch the ground. Hey Todoroki. Shoto barely shifted, merely sliding his gaze towards the voice he had grown accustomed to hearing over the year. Midoriya was scratching at the fabric in his pockets, looking at Shoto through sorrowful eyes. He looked at the pavement once again. Hello. Sometimes, it slipped his mind that Midoriya and Bakugo had met his family, save for his mother. Knowing that they had likely met Rei at her son's funeral made Shoto tighten his fists. He despised that. How are you holding up? Bakugo asked, leaning against the wall. It wasn't because the situation was nonchalant for him, Shoto knew. He could tell that the same pity swam through him as the people inside. He despised that too, but he wouldn't show it. Instead, Shoto shrugged. I'm fine. T's fine, Sho. You're doing good. He wasn't, but he barely knew Natsuo, so he should be. Midoriya's unshed tears didn't go unnoticed. His sympathy spread so far, Shoto could only watch and regard him with weary indifference. Energy required to listen to his spilled words was something Shoto didn't have. As it turned out, there wasn't much even Midoriya could say to a friend who had lost a brother he had only met once. Todoroki, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry, Natsuo. Shoto flinched, standing up and pushing past them. Thanks. I'm sorry too. Shoto tossed a look over his shoulder at Bakugo with a faint twitch of his eyebrow. Don't be. He turned his back on his friends. It's not like any of you killed him. He couldn't handle it. Ghosts never seem to leave the Todoroki abode once they pass on. They creaked and floated aimlessly, hiding in the holes of door frames and watching with their dull eyes. Shoto felt those eyes pinned on him whenever he stepped foot in his own home. Disappointment and resentment buried their way into his head like insects, crawling around and fooling him into thinking they came from his dead brother. He already knew what Tuya thought of him, after all. He was never alone anymore, and it terrified him. Perhaps Shoto Todoroki died a little bit that day too. The world knew that his family was deteriorating, one by one. Tuya had made sure that he opened that door wide enough for everyone to look inside and see their skeletons, cobwebs and all. And when he was finished, he slammed the door shut, trapping Shoto and his family inside. Pound on the door all they want, scratch until their nails turn to shreds. Everyone knew who they really were and nothing would be the same. Tuya wouldn't stop until Endeavor was the last one of them alive. It made family meals incredibly awkward and painstakingly slow. Now that Tuya was finally making good on that chilling promise he made in Jaku whilst waltzing atop Gigantomachia, eating as a family didn't happen anymore. Instead, Fuyumi and Shoto ate like prey. They ate every meal like it was their last. They spoke every word with strain and exertion like all they were doing was running out the clock until Tuya got his hands on them. And he was supposed to be a hero. How shameful. Shoto, Endeavor said slowly, not bringing his gaze up to look his son in the eye. If you don't want to finish the school year, it's understandable. No, he replied, but he didn't lift his head either. No, I want to go back. He needed to go back, even if he had to force himself to. Endeavor nodded, his frown deepening. Shoto never cared enough to notice previously, but his father had begun to look old. He hadn't gained many wrinkles or other, but he still looked like he had aged 100 years. His eyes no longer held that familiar edge to them, his shoulders slacked, and his hair was beginning to gray. It was jarring. Bad as it sounded, he had never considered that his father would die anywhere other than on the battlefield. For as long as Shoto could remember, Endeavor trekked the field. Not being laid to rest alongside the place his footprints mattered was strange. But Shoto knew his father. The edge had dulled, but it wasn't gone. There was one last villain that he wanted to deal with before he even considered retirement. Dabi was still out there, articulating every way he could make Endeavor suffer. Now that he had finally pushed the first domino, the rest would follow suit. Tuya would hunt the rest of his family down without mercy. Shoto wanted to be a hero, but when he looked at his father and saw nothing but the wisp of an inferno, he wondered if that was all that awaited him down that path. He wondered if it was worth selling his soul for a title so meaningless and cruel. He wondered if he could even survive until then, or if he would ultimately pay the price for a crime that he was a victim of. Shoto twirled his food around his chopsticks, though no one batted an eye at the impolite gesture. It was only the three of them at the dinner table, which wasn't unusual per se, but with everything that had come to light, it felt wrong. Natsuo never stuck around the table for very long whenever he visited, but knowing that he would never eat with them again drove away any appetite Shoto thought he had. May I be excused? He asked, already beginning to climb to his feet. Fuyumi bobbed her head absently. Yeah, of course. Get some rest, Kay? After swallowing down cement, Shoto nodded. Love you. So hesitant, so deplorable. He didn't say it enough, but it was true. He didn't say anything enough. The sound she made was full of surprise, which he winced at. Even Endeavor flicked his gaze up from behind his folded hands. Fuyumi gaped, but gained her composure hastily with a sad smile that looked like plastic. Love you too, Shoto. He had never felt more transparent. Normally, Shoto fled to his bedroom whenever his emotions started to swirl. After all, the only reason smoke didn't last was because it dissolved back into the clouds and the rainfall. His room was his cloud, where he locked himself into diffuse and eventually vanish. He found himself in the garden this time, admiring the array of precious flowers that twinkled like rainbow stars and in turn, wilted like them. Koi swam in the pond, dark sunlight reflecting off their scales and the water with a warm glow. They were far more appealing than a garden called for, but Shoto loved them. He could vaguely recall coming out here when he was younger to feed the fish, though only when Endeavor was out at the agency. Natsuo had joined him at times, and other times it was Fuyumi. No words were shared, not any that Shoto could remember. They only kneeled on the stones and tossed food into the water, watching with reservation and disinterest. It was a distraction, Shoto knew. Just a way to make everything stop, even for a little while. The visits to the koi pond were never spoken about. Shoto didn't know why, but he couldn't seem to mind. It just happened, nothing else to say. The back door opened and slid shut, though Shoto didn't turn. There was only one person it could have been. "Sho, is everything okay?" Fuyumi asked, coming to sit down beside him. She stroked the water with her fingers, frightening the koi to the other side of the pool. "How do you deal with it?" Shoto followed the fish's jolting movements and unpredictable swim patterns. Shoto hadn't really known Tuya very well. He was only 4 when he died, so if any good memories of his brother existed, Shoto had forgotten about them. Fuyumi, however, was a year younger than Tuya and could do nothing except remember him. A curse or a blessing, Shoto wasn't sure. Fuyumi had attended both of her brother's funerals now. Shoto, in reality, had only attended one. His sister let out a breath, craning her neck to admire the darkening sky. Shoto copied her. Amaterasu indeed was beginning to retire for the night, allowing her brother his grace. Tsukiyomi's moon was a saucer, its pale glimmer barely recognizable yet. The gods did not watch over the Todoroki family, however. And if they did, then they must adore tragedies. "You know," Fuyumi began, "sometimes I wish that I didn't have to." She released a low laugh when Shoto gave her a confused sidelong look. "It would be easier, wouldn't it? To just stop. But then everything would stop, and that's the scary thought. I know that you don't know me very well, and I don't know you, but you're my brother, Shoto. Just like Natsuo and just like Tuya. I want to be here for you, even if it hurts. And what would you do if I wasn't here either?" Shoto wanted to ask her, but the words were lodged in his throat. What would he even do with the answer? "I wish that it had been me," he murmured. "It would have been better that way, I think." He knew he was right. Natsuo had been her brother, while Shoto had been her responsibility. If he had died instead, then maybe her eyes wouldn't have dimmed so much and her smile would be just a little brighter. Fuyumi had no one to hold on to. She had no one left who understood what she had been through and no one to confide in. Perhaps she would be better off alone than stuck with a brother who would only serve as a constant reminder of everything she had lost. "Don't." A single word, but it cut through the silence like a scream. His brow furrowed, but he indulged it. "Don't what?" Fuyumi shook her head, blinking fiercely. The anger of 1,000 storms rumbled in her eyes, in her hands, in her chest as she stared at him. "Don't say that." Shoto didn't understand. But something underneath that anger threatened to unravel him right then, so he retreated from pushing her further for an explanation that made any sense. Unfolding his legs and getting to his feet, Shoto dipped his head. "I'm sorry." "No, it's just..." Fuyumi didn't stand. She didn't even look away from the fish and their little paradise. "I love you, Shoto. And I know it's hard. Trust me, I know. But please never say that again." And just like that, her voice had shriveled down to a rasp. She was back to reading the eulogy, recounting the moments she cherished with Natsuo while holding the knowledge that new memories would never be created. Shoto closed his eyes solemnly. Flashes of red ink and black flakes, gray eyes looking up at him, the ruffle of his hair, a hand that dropped like an anchor. "Okay," he whispered. "I'll never say that again." He left his sister to watch the koi's pond turn dark. "It's okay, it's all right," Shoto choked out, holding his brother and remaining oblivious to the blood that continued to stain his costume. Natsuo's hair was barely white anymore. Washed in blood, it wasn't even recognizable. Shoto held back a GG. Help's gonna be here soon. Just hold on, I promise. I promise, Natsuo, they're coming. Natsuo's eyes were glazed over in agony, but he offered Shoto a lazy grin as blood dripped from his mouth. Knowing when to stop talking was never his forte. I'm kind of tired, Shoto. Alarm bells shrieked through Shoto's veins and he cradled Natsuo closer, just to selfishly ground himself. Don't close your eyes, Natsuo. I'm begging you, stay awake. It'll be okay, just don't close your eyes. Everything was gone except for the two of them. Shoto didn't focus on anything else. Fabric clung to his skin after its drink, dragging him underwater where nothing could be heard and nothing could be seen except for what was in front of him. His brother was dying in his arms. "T's fine, Sho. You're doing good." His words were slurred and filled with every emotion Shoto never got to see in his brother. It was a foreign sight. Still, something in him splintered. Shoto cried then, quiet and resigned and making as little noise as possible. Tears bloomed in Natsuo as well, falling like ink down his face. "I'm sorry, Natsuo," Shoto breathed, remembering the way Natsuo had crumpled. After learning about Tuya's demise on Sikoto Peak years ago. Death had come for one of them that day, and it hadn't been Tuya at all. "I'm so sorry." Nothing like anger or regret appeared in Natsuo's face. He let out a shaky exhale, a laugh. "Can't remember the last time I saw you cry." His brother reached up to weakly ruffle his hair. Shoto let out the same laugh that Natsuo had. It was pitiful and thin and mirthless. And then the weight on his head vanished, just like the life in Natsuo's eyes. Shoto nudged his brother, not daring to take a breath. "Natsuo." He stared at nothing. The wisp of light was gone, snuffed out in the instant that Shoto had blinked. "Natsuo, wake up." But his eyes were open. They were just so empty and horrifying and... Shoto woke with a start, finding himself enmeshed in his sheets. His breathing was ragged and hoarse, and he gingerly touched his throat. Had he been shouting in his sleep? He strained his ears, though everything was soundless except for himself. No one was coming to check on him. He was grateful. That hadn't been a dream. Shoto's dreams weren't dreams, not anymore. They weren't even nightmares, though he wished that they were. In their place, memories plagued his head while he slept, reminding him of his biggest failure. There was so much more he could have done. He could have left Natsuo's side to put out the flames and carve a way for heroes and ambulances to arrive. But if Natsuo had died alone, without even his stranger of a sibling by his side, Shoto tugged at his hair, restraining his shudders and staggering from his cot. He pulled his door open and stumbled into the hallway, keeling next to the toilet before gagging up his dinner. Shoto raked his hands over his scalp violently before moving to grip the sides of the sink hard enough to turn his knuckles pale. The mirror mocked him, showing him his terrorized face. Everything about it looked wrong. His eyes were too wide, his scar was too big. His hair was static-filled, unruly, untamed, and Shoto had never wanted to rip it out more. All too suddenly and with too much force, Shoto opened the cabinet, nearly snapping it from its hinges. He snatched a bottle of pills at random, not holding a bother for what they were supposed to do. Shoto stared at the little tablets inside. He had considered suicide before. Years had passed since then, those cursed thoughts long banished from his mind. But as he held the bottle in his hand, it struck him how easy it would be. Down them all in one go. To truly ensure his own death, he might fill the bathtub and pass out underneath the water, drowning with medicine in stomach. He could do it right now, just tip his head back and consume every last one. Everything would stop after that. The pain, clawing at his head every day and every night, would vanish. In a twisted way, perhaps his heart would begin beating again. And it sounded nice. It would be easier, wouldn't it? To just stop. It would. Shoto wanted everything to stop and he was holding the solution in his hand. What else was there to do? What else was there to lose? But when he brought the bottle up to his lips, he hesitated. The funeral. Fuyumi's eulogy, her voice about to shut down. But then everything would stop and that's A scary thought. Natsuo had been the only thing she could rely on some days. When it got too overwhelming, Natsuo knew exactly how to step up and fill in for her. He knew exactly how to manage a babbling young Shoto, how to wrap his wounds and dry his tears with the same cool touch she had. I want to be here for you, even if it hurts. Fuyumi was still here. She still got up every morning and through her excused absence from work, spent careful time catching up on the papers she had yet to grade. Fuyumi continued to live and Natsuo had been her rock, her anchor, her sun. Everything. Shoto placed the pill bottle back into the cabinet, letting out a trembling sigh. He would sooner become a villain than force Fuyumi to attend the funeral of her third and final brother. Nothing had changed about Yue, at the very least. That was nice. Principal Nedzu had all but forced them to move their things to the school's campus after a month had passed since the service. Shoto wished he could be mad, but in truth, he was relieved to be getting out of that devil house. Never a good thing happened there. He could still feel the pill bottle in his hand. His principal was an odd man, which Shoto wasn't sure he appreciated. He spoke in nothing but riddles and expected others to understand the method behind his madness. Shoto may have been fine with leaving the house, and he did understand the reason he and Fuyumi were going to UA, but he wasn't thrilled about facing his classmates once more. Tuya had been hard. Everyone viewed him from a distance, observing him without seeing him. Of course, they checked up on him, but Shoto had been alone. There weren't many people who could empathize. But now, there was one person who might think that they have a vague understanding. Shoto would like to avoid him. When Shoto arrived at the Heights Alliance with Nedzu in tow, helping him with his bags, Fuyumi had been taken to the building that all families would be staying in. Aizawa-sensei greeted him. Shoto bowed immediately, his gaze lingering for too long on the eye patch that he wore and not long enough on the sorrow that stained his face. Death never gets easier, Todoroki, he said. I'm sorry for your loss. You as well. He had never outright told his teacher, but Shoto didn't forget about Midnight Sensei. He was faintly sure that the two of them weren't just work friends, but friends in their daily lives. Sensei appeared as though something else was on the cusp of leaving his lips, but it would never be heard. Nedzu handed him Shoto's bags, both of them ignoring Shoto's protests, explaining that he could carry his own belongings. Come on, kid. Sensei shrugged towards the elevator. Shoto trailed after him, keeping his eyes on Sensei's back. Welcome back to you, Todoroki. Nedzu called. Shoto barely looked his way before the door closed in front of him. He leaned against the handlebar, tapping his foot and scratching at his sleeves. Sensei must have noticed the uneasiness wafting like an aroma, likely due to his training in detecting signs of discomfort from victims and perpetrators alike. Are you all right? He asked. Shoto didn't respond. That question was starting to become a warning bell. Did Sensei really care, or was it under the requirements of teaching? Sensei cared. He had to. He cared enough to expel students who simply didn't have what it took to be a hero, not wasting time letting them catch their dreams before they fell through their fingers like sand. Why wouldn't he care enough to ask about one of his students' overall well-being? Shoto remembered the smell of powder from the pill bottle, so close to his mouth. I'm fine, thank you, he muttered, because he was tired of saying it. Why couldn't it be true? Why couldn't he just be fine? Aizawa-sensei hummed, not needing a look of disbelief to make it known that he wasn't buying any of what Shoto was selling. Shoto was okay with that. It didn't really matter much, considering Sensei was powerless to do anything about it. The man had the ability to erase quirks, not emotions. The elevator dinged open and Shoto stepped out, followed closely by his teacher. I can take my stuff from here, Sensei, thanks. He bowed once more, noticing a glint of metal at Sensei's ankle. The prosthetic legs were far easier to operate than arms, so perhaps both of them should count their blessings. Sensei waved a hand. Don't mention it, kid. He glanced at the stairwell, a frown tugging his face. I already told everyone to not get on your case about anything, but you know how your friends are. They care and are concerned. They'll give you as much space as you need, but don't completely push them out. Right. And, Sensei added, if you need anything, the entire UA staff is here for you, not just me. Remember that. I appreciate it, thank you. The painfully analytical gaze of Aizawa-sensei surveyed him similar to how an organism would be underneath a microscope, ready to poke and prod at him for answers or reasons behind his indifference. But Shoto could be wrong. With sensei's adaptability in detecting subtle social cues, it would be a skill which would naturally extend to his students. Shoto had been wrong before. It'll be okay, just don't close your eyes. Shoto had been so wrong before. Well, I have nothing else to tell you. Shoto looked at sensei as he lightly nodded. Except, I'm glad you're back, Todoroki. I don't want to be here. Me too, he said, and didn't let go of his breath until sensei disappeared into the elevator. He closed his door behind him, but before Shoto could even get comfortable within his dorm, let alone unzip his bags, a knock disturbed him. It appeared there was no escaping the wrath of kindness, though surely whomever it was could have waited longer than a few minutes upon his arrival. Regardless, they knew he was inside. Ignoring them would be futile as well as disrespectful. He opened the door to none other than Tsuyu, who gave a welcoming smile that Shoto didn't return. Hi, Todoroki, sorry to bother you. She waited for him to say something, which Shoto only realized belatedly after the silence lasted for too long. He coughed. Right, it's fine. Are you feeling up for dinner with us tonight? She asked. No pressure or anything, but I'd feel bad for not at least asking you. The thought alone of scraping utensils and incessant chattering tightened Shoto's chest. Really, there were only a few things worse than that, though he would never voice it to her. I don't think so, he said. Realizing the blunt rejection, he scrambled to come up with a nicer way to say it and tacked on, but thank you for thinking of me. She didn't appear hurt either way, but Shoto felt slightly better about himself with a prettier truth out in the open. Yeah, of course. Feel free to come down if you change your mind. Tsuyu began to walk away, but paused in the middle of the hall. She glanced back at him. Some of us are also pulling an all-nighter, so feel free to join. You don't have to if you don't want to, but it'll be fun. Your call. Shoto nodded once, swallowing thickly. Right. She gave one last smile before finally leaving him alone. He closed his door on her back, taking in a heavy breath that rattled his stomach. This felt familiar. Conversations grating and wearing him down like he was nothing but an ant-hill under someone's heel. It felt like he was back to his first weeks at UA, wanting to throw up all of the food he never ate because someone had the nerve to be kind to him. Shoto scowled, unzipping his bags and beginning to unpack. Peering inside of his dresser drawer, he grimaced. Clothes that were neatly folded at one point were sprawled, wrinkled, and in need of ironing. He remembered how he had grabbed blindly and packed his things to leave campus faster than immediately. Was cleanliness any more a priority now than it had been during those terrible minutes of quiet hysteria? He wasn't inclined to think so, but his hands begged him for something to do to chase away the feeling of smooth plastic and grooved bottle caps. Time passed in hazes. No matter what he did, nothing resumed the feeling of home that he had gotten when he first moved in. A candle of hope flickered in his chest whenever he wiped at a smudge or spot. It was a fool's hope that making everything look perfect would help him forget. If he could just forget that every one of his classmates were waiting for him to come out and say hello, forget that he should eat dinner but not trusting his stomach to keep it down, forget that he was only at UA because his eldest brother was a crazed murderer hellbent on seeing his family die, forget that he had already succeeded with one of them, forget that he was so close to leaving Fuyumi all alone and giving Tuya exactly what he wanted, then maybe he would be okay. Or maybe he would finally sink right into the darkness underneath the ice. Shoto gathered every piece of wrinkled clothing and dumped them in the garbage bin. He woke in the middle of night once again, his mouth dry and sandpaper rubbing his throat raw. The cicada's wails accompanied him as he treaded down the stairwell, the light buzzing of conversation drifting like a breeze. Tsuyu had mentioned that a few students were pulling an all-nighter. Shoto hadn't known what that meant then, but he did now, and a small part of him wanted to retreat and fall asleep dehydrated. Stay quiet. Don't engage. An eerily recognizable pair of statements from his childhood. Discomfort wormed through him as he entered the dark kitchen and picked a glass, fresh memories of sneaking through his house to wrap an injury he had missed earlier that day flourishing uninvited in his brain. He was at UA. He was surrounded by classmates. He was surrounded by ice. He would be protected. Natsuo, wake up. He would be protected. Hello, Todoroki. What are you doing up so late? Shoto spun at the voice, gasping as he dropped the glass and stumbling back as it shattered. He barely caught himself against the edge of the sink, grappling with his wild breath as he focused on the figure in front of him. Ida took a step back, lifting his hands and raising his brows. I needed some water, Shoto rasped pathetically. Who else was here? He peeked into the lounge, finding plenty of faces staring back at him. Solicitude tied all of their features together. He hadn't realized so many of his classmates would be participating in the all-night. Briefly, he wondered if it was something else he had missed out on growing up. I'll clean up the mess. I'm sorry for disrupting you all. Please don't apologize, Todoroki, Yaoyorozu said, standing to stretch into an unnecessary bow. We're happy to see you all right. If anything, I'm sorry, Ida said. I scared you, Todoroki, but please know that it wasn't my intention. Shoto shook his head, not brushing away the hair that fell in his face as he studied the shards of glass on the tile. Being treated like he was a fragile sculpture was new, and only as of late. Ever since Tuya. But Natsuo's death amplified their cushioned words. It's okay. I was too deep in thought, anyway. I should have noticed you standing there. The conversation lulled. The air felt heavier than before, like Shoto's mere presence was a blanket that smothered all of their laughter and grins. He took it as an opportunity to crouch out of sight behind the countertop and start cleaning the mess he had created. Out of sight and out of mind, with any luck. Someone new had shuffled into the kitchen, but Shoto didn't look up. All he could tell was Ida's departure back into the commons. Here. Midoriya got down to his knees and wiped the broken glass into a paper bag with a napkin. It'll keep the smaller shards from nicking you, he explained. Shoto just nodded. He copied what Midoriya had done, stuffing the napkin into the bag when he finished and tossing both into the trash. Midoriya only watched as Shoto moved past him. He caught Midoriya's eyes for only a moment, but it was enough for him to witness the tear-soaked grief caught up in them, and it was almost enough to make Shoto falter. Who was that look for, he wondered. Had that day he spent with Natsuo and their family during Endeavor's internship meant so much to him? But no, the two had barely exchanged words at all. So how could someone hold that much compassion for a stranger? How did Midoriya have the strength to mourn so deeply over someone he didn't know? Shoto's feet carried him away before the words could form on his tongue or the courage could gather in his head. Some people were mysteries, he presumed, and others should stay that way. He withdrew back into the shadowed hallway, ignoring the friendly whistles of goodbye from his classmates, a delicate twinge of guilt warming his ears. As he climbed the stairs, he felt someone graze his wrist. They didn't grab it. Shoto stopped. Todoroki, may I talk to you? Ida asked, holding out a glass of water. For just a moment? Suspicion swarmed him as he noticed Ida's nervous ticks in his hands and when he adjusted his glasses despite them being perfectly set on his face. The signs were there, nothing but blemishes on his actions and words. Bribery, a simple promise that doesn't make sense to decline. It was nothing but manipulation meant to force him into a corner. Shoto touched his wrist. Though not utterly, his heart softened alongside the steel in his gaze. Fine. He took the water from Ida. Ida's eyes glimmered at him. I truly appreciate it. The pair of them moved to the bridge in the stairwell. Shoto absently ran his knuckles against the plastered walls. His eyes had fully adjusted to the darkness, but standing beside a window that allowed the moonlight to soak inside made it seem less lonely and vast. A cough came from Ida to break the serenity. Shoto blinked up at him. What did you want to say? First and foremost, I'm very sorry for your loss. Thanks. Formalities would only be the new greeting for a short while, Shoto reminded himself. Ida wasn't doing it on purpose, but it would never be pleasant. The words would still cut every time he heard them, unintentional reminders of who was gone, but Shoto would always say nothing to counter them. And Todoroki, for what it's worth, I would like to give you my empathy as well. Shoto's expression dampened, not out of appreciation. Empathy, he challenged, his voice nothing short of a snake's hiss. How so? Perhaps I'm mistaken, but I may have an inkling of understanding for what you're going through. If you would like comfort of any kind, my door will always be wide open. Shoto was stunned. Had he heard that correctly, or was cotton stuffed in his ears? All he could tell was that his breath had shallowed and a vice clamped itself back over his heart. Ida knew nothing of what suffering meant. Rage had fueled him towards Stain's ferocious blade, yet he was pulled back still. When he returned home, he may have hung his head and pleaded for forgiveness from his brother for what he had done and tried to do, but in the end, he had received it. Ida couldn't know how it feels for every hope to extinguish and for every plea to be met with racked silence. The worst part about the silence was that it felt like an answer. Ida never had to experience that type of torture, and yet he considered their circumstances similar enough to offer a more NTMT shoulder to lean on or shirt to weep into. Shoto couldn't hide his offense. If his anger wasn't a surmounting blizzard that wanted nothing more than to swallow every tree, every boulder, every cloud, maybe he would have been gentler. "Do you think our situations are comparable, Ida?" he asked quietly, his words that of piercing ice. "Do you think that it's your fault that your brother is paralyzed? Or that if you were never born, or if you had killed yourself while you were still young, then the hero killer never would have existed?" Ida looked paler than snow, but Shoto wanted to see him freeze. He wanted to give Ida that inkling of understanding. "Your brother is still here. At least you can still talk to him, and he can respond. At least you can go and ask him what his favorite FING color is, or if he's named any of the fish in your koi pond. At least you don't have to live with the fact that you're the reason your family fell apart." Shoto took in a harsh, cracked breath, but his eyes never grew wet. "I do." If Ida had words ready to spit back at him, Shoto never heard them. He did what he did best. He fled. Right back to his room. He closed his door with shivering hands, fumbling with the lock. His right hand was chilled to the bone, and when Shoto looked at it, he realized he was carrying a block of ice that vaguely resembled a cup. Smashing it against the wall or on the ground was compelling, but someone would notice and check on him. He settled for ripping his balcony door open, throwing the iced glass as far as it could, and sending a blast of fire to melt it in midair. It didn't help to pacify the snowstorm that ravaged his head, not in the slightest, but neither did crumbling to his knees and hanging onto the railing like a lifeline while dragging his fingertips over the rough, asphalt platform of the balcony. He did it anyway. How stupid he was, believing that his first night back in the dorms wouldn't end with him running away from the forest fire he had set off. That demed smell of powder of back, overpowering the breeze that ruffled his hair and dried his eyes. The sting, too, of trying to pry open the bottle too relentlessly, breaking the skin on his fingers before tearing the cap off and hesitating. A knock. Barely audible, but it didn't matter. Shoto heard it and pulled himself to his feet, lurching towards his cot. Isolation was the only way he would let himself fall apart. He didn't need an audience to witness his every flaw, every defect, every fault, not when he couldn't even look himself in the mirror. "Todoroki, you don't have to talk. I heard a shout and got worried. Please just let me know you're okay." A knock back, maybe, or a note. "Whatever you want, just respond, please." "Go away," Shoto croaked deplorably, the words that had been spoken to him not quite ringing clearly. He slumped onto his bed, curling up as he tapped his bloody fingers together and watched with vacant fascination. "Okay." There's a sigh on the other side of the door. Relief, possibly, or drowsiness. I'll give you space. This is Midoriya, by the way. Izuku. You know that's sorry. I'll go now, so please have a good night. And, see you tomorrow." A moment passed, then two, before a quiet pad turned to solitude and faded down the hall. Shoto closed his eyes, not as eager to plunge into dreams as he was to forget about the blood that leaked onto his sheets. Oh, it would be a pain to clean up in the morning if morning came at all. He pretended that he hoped it would. Nothing had outwardly changed about her brother. He still had to be coaxed into conversation, his lips otherwise sealed shut, and he still preferred secluding himself far away from others. He still seemed to enjoy the zarusoba she made for him, though the quantity he ate had depleted considerably ever since that day. Nothing had outwardly changed about her brother, except for his eyes. They betrayed him. Completely. Whenever Fuyumi looked at them, she felt nothing stare back at her. Their cold insouciance had wilted into an emptiness far more unnerving than mere apathy could ever be. It was as though someone had taken the heartless liberty of wringing him dry of the emotions he once wore just under his sleeve. Every so often, especially after his first months at UA, she could have caught the tiniest sliver of confusion or giddy or contentment beneath his ice-tinted gaze. Now, there was nothing. He didn't get excited anymore. He didn't get competitive anymore. He didn't hope anymore. He only existed. It was a vile thought that flitted through her brain, but Fuyumi figured that their mother once had that same air before being sent to the psychiatric ward. "Are you good to go?" she asked Shoto, shaking herself free of her mind and taking in the sight of the fortress that was UA. Fuyumi had been told by Shoto's homeroom instructor, Shota Aizawa, about the new bells and whistles that UA had implemented for security. He seemed to have forgotten to mention that those bells and whistles were made of solid titanium. He shrugged, tugging at the bags that draped over his shoulders. Yeah. Even that single word felt oceans away. Mechanical movements and replies that held no real value weren't uncommon for Shoto, but concerns still lingered in her pursed lips. Fuyumi could never forget the words that Shoto had spoken to her as he left the dinner table, "Love you." One innocent disclosure that sounded so broken and so hollow, a star burning itself to nothing. It was too much of a goodbye. In her surprise, she had hobbled out a clumsy "love you" too, but when he walked off, every flashing light blared red at once. She just knew that if she didn't check on him that very same day, she would regret it for the rest of her life. Words would never be enough to describe the solace she felt seeing her brother the next morning, air still filling in his lungs and arms still bare of any slitted wounds. If she had done nothing else right as his sister, she had at least done that. Fuyumi could have prattled on endlessly to Inko Midoriya's generously open ears. She was a woman who could not have looked any more similar to her son, all the way down to her round, delicate gaze that hid a fierce diamond's edge and hair of newly dewed moss. Beyond appearances, she must have passed down Midoriya's eagerness to share opinions and insight, as well as the slight social anxiety, but it was only another thing that both women had in common. After finishing her explanation of Shoto's interest in studying other languages besides English, Fuyumi held her steaming cup of tea to her lips. "It's delicious," she commented. Inko hummed, giving her a knowing smile. Their exchange began to ebb slowly, but Fuyumi was content in the quiet. Inko sat next to her, looking at her own mug with conflicted sighs. "Is something else on your mind?" Fuyumi asked, curiosity enlightening her tenacity. Inko tilted her head, her brows knitting together. "I suppose," she said, placing her mug down on the coffee table and playing with the threads of her sweater. "It's only, would you like to tell me about your other brother?" "Natsuo?" Fuyumi shrunk slightly, hugging her arms to her stomach. While it was true that Shoto had avoided any topics alluding to him, Fuyumi understood that he was simply too buried inside his own head to ask. Those memories and regrets hurt just a little too much. "Not quite, you see." Inko paused, fiddling with her hands. "I would hate to dredge up old wounds, so this will always be up to you, but would you like to tell me about Tuya?" That caught Fuyumi wide-eyed and scattered. Unsure of the question that had been asked, she stared. No one had ever asked about Tuya, especially not after his video. His name alone was a curse to some. It was a name that certain families flinched from, and for good reason. In his own words, he had taken the lives of over 30 innocent people, and in every sense of the word, he was a monster. Even still, Fuyumi was his sister and he, her brother. Denying that would be heinous to the families who lost loved ones to Tuya's blazing anger, and it would erase all of the torment that her family had gone through that created Dabi. Perhaps despicably, she thought of the worry that consumed her childhood for her older brother. She thought of the way he would enthusiastically show her a new trick he learned with his flames, elation burning in him as bright as his quirk, and of the moments of conflict they shared when Fuyumi bandaged Tuya's broken and seared skin. He was different, all the way back then, Fuyumi murmured, tossing glances over her shoulders and hoping no one would hear her speak so openly of Tuya. Remembering any good moments shared between all three of them felt like a betrayal to Natsuo. But Tuya had left, leaving behind a jawbone and a wildfire, and returning only to take Natsuo to where all of them thought he had been laid to rest. I just figured that if he were still alive, he still would have loved us. She could not have been more mistaken. Shoto had recounted to her and Natsuo at his bedside the days after the war in Jaku how Tuya had promised to make their father suffer by getting rid of his masterpiece. He told them that Tuya had been the one to send ending after Natsuo, giving their brother his first taste of fear for his life. Thinking about it led to a dangerous headspace, one of her drowning in the fear and heartbreak of not knowing whether Natsuo knew he was dying or not while Shoto held him. After 3 full days of strangled silence from siblings too lost in their fresh grief for words, Shoto and Fuyumi had been alone at the dinner table. It started very small, a barely audible shuddering, nothing louder than a mouse's squeak, but it grew. Fuyumi looked at Shoto, thinking back to the toddler that she had allowed to clutch at her shirt and wail when no one else would spare him a glance, and saw that very same boy. It had been the last time she saw him cry before he turned to stone. She shifted away from Inko as she released an icy breath of frost. But I don't know if he ever did. Softly grazing Fuyumi's shoulder, Inko asked, "Would you like a hug, dear?" Fuyumi nodded weakly, allowing herself to be swept up in a hug that felt so much like her mother's. Tears were not shed, but her cheeks burned and her muted sigh was wet. Strange as it felt, she couldn't deny the warmth that blossomed and welcomed her home as she received the embrace that she had learned to give her brothers and never expected to have returned. "You don't deserve any of this," Inko said faintly as she pulled away to look Fuyumi in the eyes, and unlike Fuyumi's, hers were unabashedly damp. "None of you do. You're so good, I hope you know that, and I hope you know that none of this is your fault." Inko's gaze were chips of emerald that sliced into her, so sharp that it almost made her forget that day at the hospital after Jaku, promising alongside her family to help in any way she could to stop Tuya. It was only a few months ago, but all it took was one of them to fall for it to turn into an eternity. Everything was ruined after that. Finding their footing felt as though it involved dragging each other down to hell just to use their shoulders as stools. Some of them would be left behind, for it was inevitable. Natsuo already had been. "Thank you," Fuyumi puffed, the dark images of Shoto's private tears at the dinner table, his carved-out gaze that kept him trapped underneath pillars of guilt and fear, his curt, one-word answers drenching her mind. "Please," she begged the imaginary gods, "don't let him be next." She stood from the couch, giving Inko a weightless smile. "There's some unpacking that I need to do, but I really appreciate you welcoming me in such a way." The tea was lovely. The tea sat, barely touched, on the coffee table. Fuyumi didn't cast a glance over her shoulder as she walked away, though she could feel Inko's follow her until she disappeared into her room. When the silence became a requiem and comfort swelled in her chest at her seclusion, she pulled out her phone and dialed the number that had been reinforced by muscle memory. A soft-spoken lady picked up on the other end, her voice soothing and by all means kind. "Hello, how may we help you?" And yet it caused gratuitous anger to unfurl in Fuyumi's stomach. She ignored it. "Hi, this is Fuyumi Todoroki." She forced her own voice into a sickly sweet tone. "Would it be possible for me to schedule a visit today to see Rei Todoroki?" There was a pause. Or perhaps it was hesitation. Nonetheless, Fuyumi knew why it was there. No matter how resilient a woman Rei proved to be when Dabi peeled back his scars to reveal the boy underneath, it had been a different type of pain to learn that she had lost another son entirely not too long after. "Are you the only one visiting Ms. Todoroki?" "Yes." "And would you be able to come in an hour? I can make a slot for 30 minutes. 30 minutes. Would that be enough time? Though, how long would her mother be willing to speak to her? Fuyumi nodded to herself, running a hand through her scalp. "Yes, that's fine. I'll be there." "Perfect, thank you. See you soon, Ms. Todoroki." Fuyumi hung up and let out a heavy sigh, tossing her glasses onto her desk to press the base of her hands into her eyes. Tears would not come, no matter how hard she tried. A thought dully flickered. Should she invite Shoto to come along? It wouldn't be hard to call the receptionist and tell her she's bringing her brother as well, but did she really want Shoto with her? Shutting out the little voice that said no, Fuyumi reasoned that Shoto deserved the day to unpack without interruption and greet all of his friends. Who was she to pull him away from that? Fuyumi would be a filthy liar if she didn't admit to resenting her family at times. It was a none less filthy truth, but it was still the truth. No matter how often she preached her longing for them to be happy, she always found a splinter of hatred kindling that she had yet to snuff out. When she looked at Shoto, she sometimes saw a ghost of fluffy white hair and a smile nicer than a freshly frozen lake, but when he turned to fully face her, that ghost was gone and it was only her youngest brother, giving her his clouded stare that treated her like glass. Natsuo would have never looked at her like that, and for those single instants, she wondered why Shoto couldn't have been the one to die. She never knew who she was talking to when she said it. To Natsuo, maybe, if his forever dreaming ears were listening, or to Shoto, offering compensation for the wishes she hoped would never come true. I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. Repeating it like a coward's mantra, telling the birds by her window and the pictures taped to the wall that she didn't mean it, that she wished it would stop. Horror always muddled those disgusting thoughts and pulled her back to reality before they could dwell. And every one of them came crashing down on her when Shoto told her at the koi pond that he wished he had died instead too. Shoto was all she had left. With Japan waiting solely for Endeavor to capture Tuya before retiring and Rei placed back into the hospital, he was all that remained of the family she once thought could become whole again. If he did die, Fuyumi would be left as a wailing woman, a pitiful husk condemned to a crumbled heart. Truly abandoned in a world that wanted her to suffer. She loved Shoto with every piece of the heart she had left, no matter how much indignation she felt. She wanted him to somehow be happy, but when looked at him, really looked, she wondered if he could remember what being happy was like. When Fuyumi passed the Heights Alliance, she briefly watched the window she knew belonged to Shoto's room. The curtains were drawn, but she could see a blurred shadow moving around. She was glad that he was getting himself settled properly. Yamada Hizashi accompanied her to his car, having kindly offered to be the hero who would safely escort her to her mother's hospital. Fuyumi knew that it was another one of UA's safety protocols for her and Shoto specifically, but she would only feel embarrassment whenever one of them had to take precious time out of their schedule to act as a silly chaperone. When we get there, Fuyumi said as she slid into the passenger's seat, would you mind just waiting in the car for me? Hizashi grinned. Not a problem. The ride was short and polite. Fuyumi knew that Hizashi was certainly the extroverted type, but she was grateful his small talk had been limited. With her first visit to Rei after Natsuo's funeral quickly coming to pass, having as much time alone with her thoughts as she could scrape together was appreciated. Once the hospital came into view, Fuyumi felt like she was imprinting on the past. She had always attended alone, the only other person she allowed to come with her being that of Natsuo himself. Hizashi's presence, noticing the way he studied the hospital like a report he was trying to wrap his head around, made her wince self-consciously. I'll be back, she told him, keeping her gaze attached to the building. Walking in, the sharp scent of hand sanitizer and bleach clogged her nose. Dry and colorless walls surrounded her, not a splash of color in sight. The woman at the desk looked up from her computer and glanced sparingly at Fuyumi before pointing in the direction of her mother's new room. There really was nothing remarkable about the ward itself. Passing nurses and attendants all smiled at her, but nothing in particular stood out. Fuyumi figured it was a good thing, keeping the world at bay outside. Nothing could disturb the patients and the patients could view the world through the looking glass. She expected many things as she stared at the door to Rei's room, not everything good. Mental illness was difficult and complex. Trying to fit it into a box would only set one up for disappointment. Fuyumi knew from experience. At the funeral, Rei had spoken to no one, especially not the ones who gave her their condolences. Fuyumi recalled the shards of perplexity in every look she gave those people, as if she didn't scarcely understand the language they were speaking. She supposed that she had spoken for Rei during her eulogy, not just herself. Not a single word had been shared between mother and daughter. Fuyumi wasn't sure if Rei knew she had been in attendance. Finally, she knocked. Come in. Her voice was still soft and laced with velvet, a gentle ribbon wrapping itself neatly around every sentence. Fuyumi pushed the door open, soaking in the sight she thought she had grown accustomed to. Rei was still perched by the window, her own personal painting that changed as the day dragged on. Her hands were still folded in her lap as she observed the passerby below her. Her hair still shone like crisp snow that glared against the sun in the early watercolor of the morning. And it felt wrong. "Fuyumi," Rei said, getting to her feet to greet her with a hug. "It's been some time, hasn't it? I'm happy to see you." "You too, Mom." Fuyumi settled herself across from her mother, who brushed her hair back and looked curiously at the door. "Are you expecting anyone?" Fuyumi asked, following her line of sight and frowning at the still door. She knew that no one other than her had planned to come visit. Rei shifted, taking a folded envelope from the windowsill. A plethora of colored envelopes were piled there, every one of them already opened. Fuyumi knew that Shoto took enjoyment in writing to their mother, as cell phones were prohibited from being used by patients. The name written in the corner of the one Rei held wasn't Shoto's, but Natsuo's. Fuyumi didn't know that Natsuo had done the same. "He hasn't written to me in a while," Rei admitted, her face downcast as she held the last letter Natsuo had sent her. The very last one, and Rei didn't even know. Fuyumi's stomach twisted. She hadn't told Shoto anything about Rei's reaction to Natsuo's death. He hadn't needed to know that their mother refused to believe her son was dead. All he knew was that she relapsed and had to be placed into intensive care once more. That was all he wanted to know before abruptly changing topics. She saw Rei at the funeral. She thought that maybe she had come to terms with it, or even accepted it. She had been wrong once again. Fuyumi tilted her head forward. "Do you remember the funeral, Mom?" she asked, fighting to keep the air in her lungs and her voice from shriveling. Metallic eyes glinted at her, sharper than nails yet so far away. What good were nails when they could not reach their mark? What funeral? And why did it have to be them? Had they been a family of malicious animosity in their previous lives? Or did Lady Luck just happen to gloss over their names? Hypotheticals were pointless. Fuyumi would be wasting her time trying to guess why life was unfair. She had always lived with the cards stacked against her and played with whatever hand she'd been dealt, not a complaint to be found anywhere but in her head. What was she supposed to do with no cards at all? Natsuo's funeral. "He's not with us anymore." Fuyumi knew it wasn't Rei's fault. The amount of trauma she had experienced in her life wasn't something her brain was supposed to be able to handle. It didn't stop her from wanting to scream it in her face, just to get it through her head that Natsuo was gone, he was dead, and he would never be coming back. Stop making her repeat it. But Rei was just like Shoto, yet they had never been more different. She was just as empty-eyed as he was. Shoto was all too aware of Natsuo's death, and Rei lived in a world completely separate, a world where a appealing lie was her truth. "You must be tired, Fuyumi," Rei said, stroking the envelope without looking at it. "And you must be so happy in that delusion." Fuyumi held back her unjust retort, occupying herself by staring down at the tiles. "He's not gone. I saw him 2 months ago at the hospital. We were visiting Shoto and Enji to speak about Tuya." "You must be mistaken, dear." The way she said it, like there wasn't anything more true than that. Like she wasn't blissfully unaware of the way Fuyumi was tearing herself apart limb from limb to keep Shoto grounded and to keep their father moving forward. Like Fuyumi herself had never thought about giving up and dropping to her knees, falling apart at every seam that leaked every day. She didn't do it, because there were still people counting on her. If blood was shed protecting them, then let her bleed. "Let's not talk about this anymore," Fuyumi murmured, forcing the simmering heat to be blown out by the chill of her quirk. "I like that idea." Rei smiled, putting the letter back among the others. "Please, dear, tell me how your day has been." Only when the sun rose the next morning and Fuyumi spent 15 stalling minutes finding a comfortable position atop her cot did she dial Shoto's phone. It rang 3 times before her brother picked up. "Hello." "Morning, Shoto huffed. "Morning." His voice was deeper than usual and full of rocks. He never was partial to waking in the early hours, no matter how much his training schedule had been drilled into him. "Are you calling for a reason?" "Well, I did want to say hi, but also, I went to visit Mom yesterday." She waited patiently for the explosion of betrayal from him, hoping that he would at least give her that instead of empty words. It hadn't been a visit to spite Shoto, but even him screaming at her would be welcome with open arms if it meant washing away the smallest bit of his desaturation. Nothing was said. Fuyumi couldn't picture what he may have looked like on the other end until, quietly, there was a wavering reply. "How is she?" So hesitant and unsure, so unlike how she came to recognize her little brother. But even so, he did dare to hope still. Ignoring an earthquake that split the earth in half would prove easier than ignoring the pure joy that lit up in her chest. Remembering Rei's adamance about Natsuo still being alive sobered her. Fuyumi had not offered the choice for Shoto to come to the hospital with her, so she at least owed him the truth. The real, unaltered truth. "It's kind of complicated, Shoto. She thinks that Natsuo isn't, that he isn't gone." The pause. "Oh." Hurt painted his voice, not even a vague attempt made at hiding it. And just like that, he snatched back the hope that Fuyumi had grazed, locking it away from anyone who could bear witness to it. She did a better job at hiding the pain. "But how was your first day back? Any problems?" Fuyumi hadn't met many of Shoto's other classmates, though from what she could piece together, Shoto was quite fond of the majority of them. When he had told her about the friend he made after the sports festival, she grinned at him with nothing but pride. Yui seemed to have been that missing fragment that helped save him from himself. Nothing had been brighter than the minute glimmer in his eyes after returning home each day. None of that could rid the mounting dismay at the silence from Shoto now. "Sho, did something happen?" she asked, holding her phone with both hands and sitting up just a little more rigidly. "No," he said at last. "I'm fine." Fuyumi bit her lip. "Are you sure? Because if I said I'm fine. Thanks for telling me about Mom." "Wait, Shoto, do you want to come next time?" she tried, just trying to keep him on the phone for a second longer. "Or go by yourself soon?" "No." Before she could even sneak in a "stay safe," a sad replacement for their pathetically stiff love yous, the line went dead. Fuyumi dropped the phone beside her with a deep breath. She slowly removed her glasses, twisted around to grab a pillow, and placed it against her knees that were pulled up to her chest. She buried her face into it and cried the same way she imagined Shoto had when Natsuo died in his arms. Shoto sat and watched. The wind whistled a graceful tune, tousling his hair as it soothed the raucous in his head. Early morning chills climbed up his spine and coolly swaddled his skin. He breathed out a sigh of mist, staring at the streaks of orange and pink that washed the sky and nervously dripped behind the skyscrapers of the faraway cities as the sun claimed her dawn. Appealing though it was, Shoto couldn't appreciate it very well. Classes started again in a few hours and he couldn't find the will to slumber during the night ever since his return to the dorms. He knew that he should go to Recovery Girl about his recent bouts of sleeplessness, but he also knew that she would prescribe pills. He just didn't trust himself. Shoto thumbed at the pavement, leaning forward to peek over the edge. Everything appeared so delicate from so high. He wouldn't jump, turning the act of suicide into a public spectacle that traumatized innocent people left a horrid taste in his mouth, but he did wonder if the impact would kill him if he wasn't careful. Behind him, the heavy metal door dragged open. Shoto scrunched his brows, feeling his shoulders constrict. Who else would be up here so early? Even the birds had barely begun their singing. Someone who never knew when to leave well enough alone, it appeared. Midoriya was a fine friend and Shoto was grateful to him for many reasons, but having to hold a conversation with him now made his stomach churn and his jaw tighten. He had an ever-running mouth that sometimes needed to be told to stop and a soul too big for his own good. Truly an unlucky combination for Shoto. "Hey, Todoroki," Midoriya said, moving to sit by him. Not next to him, Shoto noted with a fleck of gratitude. A few feet of empty air separated them, never verbally acknowledged by either. "I didn't know you came here too." "I don't." Shoto wasn't lying. He had never known what the roof to the dorms looked like until recently. He wished that he never did, but not many things ever went to plan, so Shoto stopped taking it personally. As simply as the wind blew and the ocean crashed, Shoto was ill-fated. Midoriya looked at him, bringing his knees up to rest his chin on them. "Why are you here then?" It felt like a loaded gun that Midoriya was handing him, though Shoto knew the question was decent. Why was he sitting on the roof, waiting soundlessly since before the sun's arrival? What was he waiting for? Nothing in particular. Nothing he deemed worth sharing. Shoto used to do everything with a purpose, all the way down to how he carried himself each day. Everything felt meaningless now. Why did it matter that he sat on the roof trying to taste the freedom of the sunrise? Nothing would ever come of it in the end. Best to just stop searching for simple answers to complicated questions and stay inside the chipping shell that he made for himself. Shoto looked back at Midoriya. To watch the sunrise. Some people needed to hear those simple answers, however untrue they were. It's definitely worth getting up to see. A small grin nudged its way onto Midoriya's face, and Shoto could only admire the effortless way he did it. It was as though he found something as mundane as a few colors in the sky a good enough reason to get out of bed. There were a very select few reasons that Shoto was able to tug himself free of the restraints that kept him warm at night, none of which being provided by nature. He wondered what it felt like to be so unburdened that the sun could draw back the curtains on one's face and reveal a smile behind them. Is that why you're here? Shoto asked, giving in to his curiosity. To watch the sunrise? Yeah. Midoriya flushed, his cheeks tinting a rosy shade. It helps clear my head. Calm me down. Being alone is nice sometimes, you know? Shoto nodded inaudibly. He ripped his gaze towards the ground and towards every ant vaguely shaped like a person. There were not many of them, but there were enough to keep him occupied. Silence cloaked them for a moment. It only made sense. After a friend, Midoriya was an introvert. He made efforts to talk to others, usually ending up fully absorbed and rewarded for those efforts, but not always. Shoto seemed to be the exception. It took two to keep a rhythm, and he was very absent. Okay, I lied, Midoriya revealed without warning. It caught Shoto with his guard down, and he flinched visibly yet involuntarily. About what? He demanded too quickly, his tone hardening. Midoriya had lied about something? Every single thing he had ever told Shoto came and went in flashes that he couldn't grasp control of. His brain finally had the excuse it needed to turn Midoriya against him. The sports festival was what he landed on. It made a ghostly amount of sense. Midoriya knew that Shoto was Dabi's brother, not just Endeavor's son. That made a difference. Midoriya had lied during their match about Shoto's quirk, or at least reconsidered his words. Or perhaps it was after the dinner he had been invited to by Fuyumi during their internship. When he had called Shoto a kind person, he didn't believe it anymore. It could have been when Midoriya, blood leaking from the wounds that marred his flesh, had attacked Dabi and insisted on Shoto being a precious friend that he wanted to protect. Taking the time to recuperate and define the words he had put out into the open may have left plenty to be desired. Midoriya gathered himself hastily, waving his hands and blushing an even deeper red. I mean to say that I didn't come up here for the sunrise. I usually do, don't get me wrong. Just not today I didn't. The train derailed very suddenly and Shoto didn't quite understand what had been spoken to him. Heedfully he pieced together, then why? Because I saw you, and I wanted to make sure you were all right. Midoriya paused, taking in a breath. So, are you all right? Shoto grit his teeth, keeping his gaze leveled. Do you really think I'm all right? He ground out, so fed up with I'm fine and I appreciate the concern. You know, I was all right. When it was just Tuya, I thought it would be hard, yes, but nothing I couldn't handle. As long as I could protect my family, then I would be all right. Now, Shoto gave a dry laugh, shaking his head, I'm not all right. Because I failed. I hesitated, and now Natsuo is dead. It's all my fault. He swallowed those last words down because Midoriya didn't need to hear any more baggage. Shoto shrugged. It's not okay. Nothing is okay and there's nothing you or I can do about it. Midoriya kept his mouth sealed as he tucked his chin behind his knees and hugged them close. Shoto didn't dare speak again. He'd said enough, far more than called for. Is that what you told Ida? Midoriya asked, turning to look at him. Shoto winced hearing the name and risked a glance at him, searching for animosity or scorn. Sunlight, instead, tangled in the boy's hair and reflected off his eyes like water, concealing any emotions he may have felt. Finding nothing useful in Midoriya's face, not even tears that he had always been so prone to shedding, Shoto buried his face into his hands and scowled. So that was what Midoriya really wanted to ask about. Admittedly, Shoto's avoidance of their class president would likely have turned out to be obvious to everyone in the dorms. He didn't exactly take extreme measures to hide it, nor did he plan on trying to. "What I told Ida doesn't concern you," he said quietly, closing his eyes to more vividly recall the stunned and hurt expression that Ida had worn upon hearing Shoto's stinging accusations. A valid response, Shoto knew, and not one that he wanted to dwell on. "No, you're right, it doesn't." Midoriya shifted, though his tone didn't quiver. "But I want you to be alright, even if it's only a little bit. And I'm worried that you're going to completely shut everyone out. It's perfectly understandable to need space, Todoroki, but please don't push us away." Shoto kept his eyes closed, focusing on the stains of dreary red and green that sparked just under his eyelids. His neck began to ache and he lifted his head. Once again, holding the back of his hand up to his face. The sun continued to climb, but he didn't look at it. Midoriya was waiting for an answer, but nothing took shape in Shoto's mouth that seemed suitable enough to use as one. So, he didn't say anything. He rose to his feet and held his tongue with icy claws. Any answer to Midoriya's plea would be a lie, and Shoto was sick of deception. The thought of Midoriya being able to see through any fiction made him cringe. It was best not to try at all. "Todoroki, wait," Midoriya called. Shoto stopped, his hand on the door. He refused to match Midoriya's passion. He doubted he could if he wanted to. One didn't match Midoriya's passion, they chased after it, and Shoto's legs were ready to buckle. "You told me that even heroes cry sometimes. Do you still believe that?" A memory of three friends sitting around a table scratched his mind like long blades of grass that tickled his ankles. Yes, Shoto wanted to say with his whole chest. He knew that heroes cried because he had seen Fuyumi cry, he had seen Kirishima cry, he had seen Midoriya cry. Of course he still believed it. He just didn't think that he was one of those heroes anymore. Shoto didn't respond to the desperate question asked of him, ignoring his own words that were twisted back at him and leaving him defenseless. Midoriya may have watched him go, but Shoto never turned around to see. Every step felt airy while every voice shook his eardrums. Shoto walked precariously atop clouds when he entered the school building, but he wanted to cover his ears from every grating voice he happened to hear. Bustling hallways surprised him when he arrived. He swiftly realized that the world continued spinning regardless of whether he thought it was falling apart or not. There was not a single thing that could slow its march, though Shoto always forgot. He attached himself to the wall, keeping his gaze lowered and unassuming. People avoided him on their own despite that. No one was eager to talk to the boy that tragedy loved. While Shoto walked down the hall, he couldn't help but take note of the many places that one could hide in, albeit unceremoniously. The vents were tight, naturally, but someone with Minetta's petite frame or someone assisted with a quirk could easily fit inside. Going up the stairwell, Shoto glanced above to the compact ridges that one could press themselves into with enough strength and stifled a shiver. When he stared out the windows, he noticed the small spaces in between sills that could be climbed, likely up to the roof. How sturdy was the glass? Could it melt at a certain temperature? Knowing Yue, it was unlikely. They accommodated all quirks imaginable, including quirks that none of their students had. He was foolish for questioning that. Tuya wouldn't come to Yue. That would be foolishness, no, it would be downright suicide. He won't kill any of you if it's not in front of Endeavor. The sharp taste of copper washed his mouth upon the thought's arrival. He swallowed blood and felt his throat grow barbed as it went down. It was nothing short of sheer pity that had Yue allow Shoto and Fuyumi to stay at their home with Endeavor for an entire month before pulling them back under their diligent watch. Shoto hadn't wanted to stay for long and Fuyumi never asked him to, but paranoia had shackled him to watch over his sister in the case that Tuya set the whole thing ablaze. No mistake would be made twice. He was glad to be away from that house for good. The bell shrieked without warning, jolting him and providing the blaring reminder that he was about to be late. His feet were sinking into the ground like quicksand, but he ripped them free and forced them to continue towards his classroom. Not a single student could be heard in the hallway, meaning Shoto must have been standing by the window for longer than acceptable. He hoped that Aizawa-sensei would tear into him for it in front of the class like he would with any other student. Shoto almost knocked on the door when he, at last, made it. Old habits die hard, it seemed. Todoroki, sensei said. His eye was a fragment of charcoal that continued to glint. Shoto had trouble keeping his gaze whilst tuning out every one of his classmates that looked at him with nauseating pity and curiosity. Do you have a late pass? I don't, sensei. I apologize. Sensei may not have felt the same tension that rode down Shoto's veins like glass shards in his bloodstream. He sighed, though not out of exasperation. Shoto couldn't pinpoint what it was beneath that vague disappointment. No, not quite. I'll excuse it this time. Go take your seat. Shoto pushed down the unreasonable bitterness at being let off the hook as he stalked past every row of desks. He didn't spare a glance at anyone, ignoring Yaoyorozu's tentative wave and looking away from Ida with a grimace. Class itself went by in waves of time. Shoto sat with his notebook open, his pencil hovering just above the page and knowing that he was supposed to be taking notes, but he didn't move his hand. He heard Sensei speaking and explaining what they should be writing down, but he slowly tapped his pencil on the top of the page instead. The bell rang and Shoto felt nothing. He closed his blank notebook and slipped it into his bag, bristling only when he noticed the approaching shadow in his peripheral. Come and see me after lunch, Todoroki. Shoto raised his head, though not completely. Sensei leaned back against the chair in front of him. No one was left in the classroom, even Midoriya having left to catch up with Uraraka and Ida after lingering by the door for him. Am I in trouble? He wouldn't be shocked if Sensei knew. Shoto was very prepared to accept punishment for not completing the assignment, but if Sensei didn't ask, he certainly wouldn't tell. Of course you aren't in trouble, kid. That was settled, then. Just try not to be late this time. The words were light-hearted, but Shoto took them seriously. He nodded. Yes, sir. Sensei dismissed him and Shoto made himself scarce. He was not marked late for his next class. The sun was finally alive and hanging in the sky like a jewel, blazing down on Shoto's face as he sat on the bench hidden in the courtyard. Overgrown honeysuckle had begun to curl around the rails, but he found it charmingly scenic, so he didn't move them. Water from the birdbath splashed and stained the concrete as a critter cooled itself off. Shoto let his eyes rest, draping an arm over them to stop the light from bothering him through his doze. His stomach didn't beg for food, but not having fed it anything for over a day rendered him ill bread after a simple walk. Loathing bubbled up in the emptiness of his stomach, replacing his non-existent hunger. He'd grown frail and inadequate ever since Natsuo's death, but even worse than that, he had lost the ambition to do better. But had he? Or had he lost the ambition to search how he might do better? Did it matter? Shoto almost recoiled, biting the cut on his tongue and drawing blood once more as a reminder. Bakugo gave a short scoff. How'd I guess you were going to be out here without any lunch in sight? Shoto bent forward, bowing his head and studying the ground. He wanted to know the answer to that as well, but it became apparent that his question wasn't rhetorical when the stillness didn't fade. What do you want? He asked, a hint of poison lacing his words. I'm not an idiot, Icy, Bakugo said, unfazed. I know that getting a FING month to grieve isn't enough time. Though, Shoto said, raising his head back up, normal people get less time. Bakugo crossed his arms over his chest. Your situation isn't normal. Don't know who told you that, but they're wrong. Shoto shook his head, but he didn't retort. Even if Bakugo was right, nothing could be changed anyway. Trying to fix anything was pointless. The past was written in stone, not sand. I also know that you haven't been eating, so here. Bakugo tossed a granola bar at him, which he caught without thinking. It was small and thin, not nearly enough of what both of them knew he should be consuming. Shoto looked at Bakugo, who waved a dismissive hand and let out a tsuke. Yeah, it's not exactly a meal, but something is better than nothing, okay? No one wants you passing out during training. Training. Shoto had forgotten about that part of his day. He wasn't thrilled by the prospect of being put back into combat scenarios, real or not, but if there was a choice, he wouldn't want to make one. Todoroki, Bakugo said, which caught his attention. He didn't make eye contact. I get that I have no FNG idea what you're going through. I'm not gonna pretend to or some sheet, but just try to keep taking care of yourself. I don't know if I should be saying this at all, but don't you think your brother would want you to do that? Shoto wanted to be mad at that. He wanted to have the indignation that helped envision himself punching Bakugo in the neck for thinking he could speak for Natsuo, but the only bleak, bitter thought he had when he heard it was, depends on the brother. And what a miserable thought that was. One brother wanted him dead, and the other he didn't even know. He almost hoped that Natsuo dmed his name from under the dirt, dmed him to hell. His brother deserved having someone to blame. At least one person wanted him to live. Fuyumi called almost every day asking how he was, and he lied to her. She asked if he wanted to go on walks around campus, and he declined. It was their routine. It wasn't fair to her, he knew, but he never did anything about it. So it stayed that way. Did you hear what I said? Yeah, I heard. Shoto struggled to his feet. He stared at Bakugo, tilting his head. Those wine-red eyes refused to soften and his mouth was set in a stern line. Nothing about him was made of ice, but gasoline. The assumption wouldn't be taken back, Shoto recognized. He nodded once, stuffing his hands into his pockets with the granola bar. Finally, the taste of ice and snow melted in his mouth, spreading through his body. He was stranded in the blizzard that he had always weaponized, knives of verglas shredding into him and wind howling in his ears. He found himself enjoying the pain. Familiarity was the warmest blanket to hide in, no matter how many times its embedded glass scraped his skin. I'm wondering something, Shoto said, and if he was beginning to grasp at straws, then so be it. Bakugo inclined his head. Yeah. Do you feel responsible for All Might's retirement? He hadn't said it to pour salt into his wounds, but Bakugo's stunned silence made him rethink if intentions paled in comparison to outcome. So, maybe you do understand. Even just a little bit. The silence, like always, was his answer. He wasn't very surprised. Ida hadn't understood in the slightest, not in the way he thought he did. Ida held no blame for his brother's accident. Shoto did. Shoto had held blame his entire life, resting it on his shoulders and dragging his feet through every one of his fallacies along the way. Though, perhaps Shoto still stood alone. Bakugo may have understood a piece of Shoto's self-hatred, but Shoto was the only one between the two of them who deserved it. The F kind of question is that? Bakugo barked defensively, taking a step towards Shoto. Apologies. I didn't mean to upset you. Bakugo looked painfully frustrated. I am not, geez, this isn't about me, okay? Just effing, he huffed, glaring at Shoto. Eat that DMN bar. Shoto watched him leave. He should have known a question like that would strike a tight chord, but he didn't regret asking. Another selfish action taken for his own gain and without remorse. What a disgusting leech he was becoming. He took the granola bar out of his pocket, tossing it into the first trash can he saw before walking back into school. Classrooms were never meant to be seen empty, Shoto thought as he entered. Sensei greeted him with a small nod, his lack of speech binding a cold stone in the pit of Shoto's throat. What did you want to speak to me about? He asked, taking a seat in the front row and bouncing his leg. When Sensei looked at him, he scratched it with small needles of ice on his fingers. Sensei didn't say anything about it, keeping his face neutral if he noticed at all. I just have a few questions, answers, and things to tell you about the rest of the day. Now, he rested an arm on his lectern, though he didn't stand behind it. Considering the fact that you're going to be resuming your regular training after this, is there anything that you would not be comfortable participating in? Shoto frowned, squeezing and twisting his fingers in his hand until he heard a pop in his knuckles. Sensei arched his brow. I don't need special treatment, sir. Yue using safety cushions during his training made him want to GG. Hero training would be useless if he had it easier than everyone else. He wasn't going to put in any effort if he didn't get the same amount of experience as his peers. He wished the voice in his head telling him to drop out would shut the hell up. After failing so many people so many times in a row, dropping out of UA would be unforgivingly sick. He would be spitting on Natsuo's grave and calling his death worthless. So many people who would want him dead for such cowardice, and so many people who would be right. If he quit, it was over. He would be pulled down into the freezing darkness that promised peace, leaving Fuyumi behind forever. So tempting yet so atrocious. Though, was it an atrocity if he warranted it? Hey, you're hurting yourself, kid. Shoto's breath hitched and he glanced down at his fingers. His left was red and he could see needle pricks of blood just under the skin. Sensei's face was indecipherable. His eye, usually stoic and purposefully vacant, was clouded and filled with something else, something darker than anger. Shoto tried not to shrink back from it. "Sorry, Sensei," he murmured. "You have nothing to apologize for," Aizawa-sensei told him curtly, but the look didn't fade. It made him appear like a liar. "But before we move on, I want to make it clear that I'm not going to provide you with any special treatment, as you put it. I'm going to provide you with the treatment that you need, and that may happen to look different from the other students. It doesn't mean that they are taking bigger strides than you are. Do you understand?" "Yeah. Yes, I understand, sir." And in truth, he did understand. The respect he had for his teacher had always been high, but never full. Shoto didn't hand that privilege out to anyone, but he thought that Sensei may have the most regardless. Good. Aizawa-sensei studied his face the same way he did on Shoto's first day back at the dorms, like he was a puzzle that was missing more than a few pieces. "I would like you to see Recovery Girl before we continue. Have her heal your hands and your leg." There wasn't anything that could slip past Sensei's keen observation, 2 eyes or 1. Shoto stood and moved towards the door. Without protest. He looked over his shoulder, seeing that Sensei was watching him go. The sun stayed fixed in the sky. The door creaked open and Shoto stepped inside. Rows of beds were neatly made and bare of any patients, predictably so. Recovery Girl sat at her desk, looking up with a scowl when he entered. "Izuka Midoriya, if that's you." She stopped abruptly, a small O slipping from her lips when she noticed him. Her expression eased, though irritation was not replaced with relief. Her eyes crinkled with no smile, motioning towards the closest cot. "Dearie me," he heard her murmur while she shuffled around the office. The clock's ticking was louder than his heartbeat. Shoto latched his focus onto it. Rhythmic and constant, soothing and safe. Shoto was safe. "Tell me, dear, how did your hand get so red?" Recovery Girl asked, pulling a stool towards him and taking a seat. After a low nod from Shoto, she gently touched his hand, tracing her fingertip over the tenderest spots. I scratched it with my ice, I think. And I twisted my fingers too hard." "You think?" Her tone lacked its usual snip as she studied the minor injuries. When Shoto refused to confirm or deny, she frowned. "May I know why it's only your left hand?" He shrugged, unsure how to explain himself. He thought that he may have had an answer, but telling her would only make it true. "I don't know," he said weakly, looking away from the hero's concerned face. "That's fine." She brushed her thumb over the dots of red. "You're close to drawing blood, you know. And none of your fingers are sprained or jammed, but with a little more pressure, it certainly could have happened." Oh. Had he really been that forceful? There was barely an echo of pain that numbed his hand. It wasn't awful, really. His leg still stung, but he didn't deem it worthy enough to tell her. There was only so much damage he could do with his breathed leg acting as a barrier, and it wasn't even torn. Recovery Girl's eyes flashed. "I will say, you look quite drained and you have training soon. Is that a problem?" If he appeared a mess, he wouldn't know. Looking into mirrors had turned into ghoulish reminders of what could happen, of what will happen, of what did happen. He looked at himself and saw too many things. Sometimes Tuya stared back at him, a smile ripping itself free and shredding the staples off of his skin. Sometimes he could see Natsuo over his shoulder, and he always spun around and was always greeted with disillusion. But through all of it, there was nothing more disappointing than seeing only Shoto look back at him. "Did you hear about the Todoroki scandal?" "He's probably stricken with grief. Bet it would make one hell of a documentary." Shoto's jaw locked. "How sad, Shoto Todoroki. How FNG sad." "Well," Recovery Girl said, breaking him free of his self-inflicted trance, I wouldn't usually say it's a problem, but to be frank, dear, I'm not sure you have enough energy for me to use my quirk on you. He deflated. Oh. He wasn't sure if Aizawa-sensei would be upset with him if he returned with bandages for an injury as easy to heal as a scratch. Questions would arise when he stepped foot back into the classroom, and they weren't questions that he intended on answering without silver on his tongue. Are you sure? Quite. Have you been taking care of yourself, Todoroki? Getting proper rest, eating enough food? Shoto nodded quietly, declining an offered pack of pretzels. I really should be getting back to class. Aizawa-sensei wanted to talk to me, but I don't think he finished before sending me here. Aizawa sent you? Something akin to sorrow drizzled on her face as she sighed. Should have guessed you wouldn't have come on your own. I suppose you and Midoriya are alike in that regard. An unreasonable amount of contempt bloomed in Shoto's mouth at the comparison. He would have liked her to elaborate, because Midoriya and him were not similar. They may have shared the same dreams at one point, but Midoriya was the only one still chasing after them. Shoto had been grabbed by the heels and pulled back into the past while his friend charged forward, setting his trail ablaze and allowing no one to follow. He thought that he was happy for Midoriya, but maybe it was just the green-eyed monster, jealousy, wearing sheep's clothing. Why did Midoriya get to save every life he stumbled upon while Shoto had to live with the fact that he couldn't even save his family? Shoto had danced with Karma before. He knew by heart the melody that she swayed to, understood every beat and every turn. There was nothing new she could show him, though, sometimes, he mistook her for destiny. All of the misfortunes and ailments he had caused by taking in oxygen and opening his eyes every morning seemed like they were going to happen anyway, no matter how much he changed or tried. When Dabi washed his hair white and grinned down at Shoto, he knew then that he had not been dancing at all. He had been played like a fool, strings sharper than teeth pulling his limbs. Karma, destiny, they really were one and the same. There was nothing to do about it. Being born was simply the worst sin he could have committed. Shoto flexed his hand, which was suddenly wrapped in gauze. The heat was gone, replaced with something cool that kissed his skin. A cream or gel of some sort must have been applied underneath the bandages. Taped together were his pointer and middle finger, and he curled them experimentally. They felt fine. There you are, dear. Good as gold, Recovery Girl chirped. He lost time again. He didn't focus hard enough on the clock's ticking. Thank you, ma'am, he muttered, sliding off the bed and back to his feet. The world tilted for a moment, and he faltered, laying his unharmed hand on the mattress behind him for balance. Recovery Girl had her back to him, putting away the dressing and roll of gauze into a cabinet and having not noticed a thing. Before you go, she said, coming back to him as he stood with one foot out the door. She handed him a white bottle, and Shoto felt his breath grow shallow. Only one will do the trick for when you're having sleepless nights, all right? Yeah, he rasped, his mouth cracked and dry. Thanks. Oh, there's nothing to be anxious about, dear, she said, and he wondered if she could sense his uneasiness or if it was written on his face. Plenty of students use these, and even taking the whole bottle won't do any permanent damage. Read the label if you're antsy, all right? Shoto was not reassured, but he folded his lips and nodded. All right. Recovery Girl finally let him leave, and Shoto followed her instructions while he walked down the hall. Like she had told him, he would typically only need one every night. If he consumed more than he should have, he should call poison control and be prepared for the uncomfortable side effects. No chance of death if an overdose occurs. He stuffed the bottle in his pocket when he approached Sensei's door. You're back late, Sensei noted expressionlessly. His eye quickly noticed the bandages on Shoto's hand. He made a low noise but didn't add anything else. It happens. Class is going to start in a few minutes, so I'll keep it brief. He watched Sensei shuffle around his papers. It didn't look like he was doing it for any reason other than to gather together the words he wanted. Okay, Sensei finally sighed, looking at him. I won't lie to you. These feelings that you likely have, the loneliness, the regret, the anger, they won't go away for a while. Know from experience how hopeless it seems, but, Todoroki, he flicked his gaze away for a barely discernible second, just don't be scared of asking for help. Everyone in this school wants you to not just be safe, but feel safe. Shoto blinked slowly, his face remaining passive. He had an obscure sense of déjà vu listening to his teacher. Had Principal Nedzu not promised that same thing after the incident at the USJ? And again, after Midoriya's encounter with Shigaraki at their mall visit. And again, after Bakugo's kidnapping at the untraceable forest camp. And again, after the war that killed Midnight Sensei and too many heroes and civilians. The only thing that remained of Yue's promises were bodies, and Shoto, still ever the hypocrite, was growing sick of empty promises. Still a hypocrite and still a coward who wasn't ready to give up on the one teacher who remained holding an ember of authenticity. Aizawa-sensei had done far too much for his class for Shoto to turn his back on him so easily. It would be a fool's notion for him to think that he was the only one suffering. I don't want to be another burden to anyone, he said, shrugging. Sensei halted. I think we're all burdens sometimes. It takes effort to care for someone, but that's why we do it. Because we care about them. We want to see them thrive however way possible. You're worth the effort it takes to care about you. Don't forget that, kid. Months ago, Shoto thought that he may have cried hearing those words. He had needed that once, when he was coming to school with black and blue and pink stains on his skin and hatred sizzling under his tired bones. When he was the dust that collected under a flower's petals, he had needed that in his head and in his ears and nuzzled beneath his heart. Now, though, Shoto could only stare and tilt his head forward, a vague attempt at a nod. Sensei did not lie, but misunderstandings never made anyone wiser. Shoto simply happened to know better now. Sensei may have expected a verbal answer, but Shoto couldn't give him one. He took his cue and allowed Shoto to return to his seat the moment his fellow students began filing inside. Shoto rolled his teacher's words over in his head, clicking his nails against the pill bottle that rested in his pocket. He still felt it, the faintest slide of warmth. He ignored it. Shoto was not to be a part of the more extreme quirk training that the rest of the class were doing. He found himself not minding very much, seeing as he was far more skilled in the exercise that he would be participating in alone. Hey, Todoroki. Not quite alone, per se, but something close to it. Because Aizawa-sensei and All Might-sensei were going to be busy guiding 19 other students, they called in a third party to act as Shoto's sparring partner. He felt guilty pulling her from her free PRD, but the choice wasn't his to begin with, so the most he could do was apologize. Don't worry about it, Nijire grinned. She stood by his side and looked out to the students who were partnering up. Tell me again what we're gonna be doing? Minimal quirk usage to deflect incoming blows, Shoto said. Wow, did ya read that from a textbook or something? He glanced at her. No. Just teasing, just teasing. Nijire stuck out her tongue, puffing up her cheeks. Shoto moved towards their own corner of the gym, a lilac-haired shadow flouncing after him. She chattered idly about things that Shoto tried to pay attention to, but couldn't. The last time the two had spoken was during their recovery in the same hospital after Jaku, Shoto trying to make amends for his brother attempting to scorch her to death and Nijire telling him that she liked her new short hair. Because there was nothing to apologize for, Shoto didn't know what else to say. Nijire had run out of things to say as well, dropping into a fighting stance and allowing Shoto to follow suit. Let's get started then. She did that very thing quickly, hooking her arm around and towards his head. Shoto immediately froze over his forearm as he raised it, forcing her hand to connect to solid ice. She pulled it back with a yelp and Shoto winced for her. There was no pain that he could find on her face, despite her punching at stone. Only a cheeky smile and a wink. He almost looked over his shoulder to check if someone else was behind him, but she pressed on before he could even move. Catching her hand on his left side, he bit back a shout of pain as he deflected the blow and created space between the two of them. Nijire spun on her heels, twirling around in a move that made her look like she was dancing as she swung her leg above her and at Shoto's shoulder. He dropped, evading the blow and sweeping his leg out. Nijire reacted accordingly, leaping into the air. As he dragged his leg across the ground, electricity jolted through his foot and up to his waist. He shuddered, springing back to his feet with a grunt and rubbing at his bandaged hand. I'm sorry about that. Nijire said, releasing her quirk and sinking back to the ground. It was a spur-of-the-moment thing, I should have thought it through better. Shoto shook his head, letting his hand rest at his side once again. It's fine. It's not that bad really. You sure? Definitely don't want to make you even more injured than you already are. I'm sure you want to get back to training with your class as soon as possible, huh? Shoto pet his head to the side. What do you mean? Nijire gave him her own addled look. Your hand, silly. That's why you're doing things differently than everyone else today, yeah. He stared down at his hand again. I don't really know. Aizawa-sensei said something about me doing other kinds of training, but that was before this happened. Think it's got to do with your brother? Shoto flicked his eyes up to her without raising his head. Nijire stood frozen, realizing what exactly she had asked. Like they were stuck in time, they stood motionless in place. She began rambling after the dust had settled around them. Oh my God, I'm so sorry, that was stupidly uncalled for. It's fine, Shoto said quietly. It was a mistake. Right, it was. I'm really sorry, Todoroki. Right. Then forget about it. He adjusted his positioning, crossing his arms over his abdomen. Could you show me what you just did? Using your quirk to get off the ground. Nijire looked like a stalk of wheat that would snap with a strong gust of wind, but she obliged and explained to Shoto her technique. During their next bout, Shoto used his ice to lift himself off the ground, successfully trapping Nijire's foot in the process. She cheered him on. The wind continued to roar, but the fire never spread. Returning to the dorms, Shoto would have liked to run back to his room and close the door on the world, if only for a short while. There was one thing that stopped him. Eri sprang off the couch when he arrived in the common room, a smile plastered on her round face. Look. Shoto did as he was told and saw a very colorful paper card soaked to the brim in rainbow glitter and messy crayon drawings. Eri handed it to him with a sing-song giggle, bouncing on her toes as he opened it. As Shoto read the almost indecipherable writing, he crouched down to Eri's level. Trying to give her a convincing smile, he pointed at the object on the bottom of the page. That's a very nice giraffe head. That's you, Eri exclaimed, covering her mouth with her hands as she laughed. Shoto didn't see it, but he played along and pretended that he was only messing with her. Eri grabbed his hand and pulled him over to Midoriya and Mirio, both sitting on the floor and drawing. Mirio waved at him while Midoriya laughed at the portrait of Shoto when he showed him. Yeah, she made cards for everyone in class and gave them to us when we got back, Midoriya explained, pulling out his own. It was made of ivy green construction paper with little stars and hearts sprinkled in the corners. You were the last one here, Mirio told Shoto, glancing at the young girl with a fond grin. She didn't want to leave until you got yours. Shoto nodded at Eri. I appreciate it. He tried walking away, but a tiny grip tugged at his sleeve. You're hurt. Eri pointed at his hand, a worried frown making her eyes wide. When she reached for it, Shoto snapped it back too quickly, startling the both of them. He could see the confusion in her face and in the way she disjointedly poked at her arms and wrists. Did someone hurt you? I'm fine, Eri, don't worry, he said as soothingly as he could, but it didn't compare to the way Fuyumi did it. He wasn't sure how she could keep her voice so benign. It was an accident. See? He showed her the clean bandages up close. No blood. I'm all right. Midoriya watched from the coffee table, his brows lacing together. Eri nodded, pawing at her eyes until they were rimmed red while Mirio tapped her back comfortingly and offered a hug. Shoto took a step back, going to twist his fingers again until he was stopped by the tape. Seeing Eri on the verge of tears because of his injury was like watching himself tear apart a newly mended tapestry with nothing but his own nails. Someone hurt you, didn't they? She repeated, tears finally falling onto the carpet. Mirio let her climb into his arms and cling to his shoulders, burying her face into the crook of his neck. Eri, hey, it's okay. He said it was an accident, we're all safe here. No, he's hurt. She was inconsolable. Shoto wanted to get as far away from them as soon as possible, but Midoriya's jailing face trapped him. He had made Eri cry and yet Midoriya didn't let him leave. The only logical reason he could think of was that Midoriya wanted him to fix the problem he created. It was rational. He thought that if someone made Fuyumi cry, he would have the ones responsible on their hands and knees apologizing until their foreheads bruised and their legs went numb. Shoto motioned at the couch and Mirio nodded, putting her down. Shoto sat next to her. "Eri, could you open your eyes for me?" he asked. Eri's crying didn't slow, but she opened them anyway and looked at him. Shoto inhaled quietly through his nose. "You were right, I am hurt. It's not because of my hand, though, I promise." He stopped, trying to wrangle a sentence together as everything in his mouth scattered at once. "It's not a physical pain." He wasn't sure if Eri would understand, but she surprised him with a nod. "Your head is hurting," she sniffled, her tears beginning to ebb. Yeah, my head is hurting." He bit his lip when Eri didn't break his gaze. "It's my brother. He isn't with me anymore. He got taken away and I'm hurt." "My mom got taken away," she said, craning her face downwards and grasping the corners of the cushions with shaking palms. "By a monster. Did a monster take away your brother too?" Shoto didn't respond. Was it a monster that took Natsuo away? He preferred not going down that path, because if Tuya Todoroki was a monster that made children shut their closet doors at night and made riots hail in the streets, then it meant that Shoto had no fate to reconcile with at all. If Tuya Todoroki was a monster, then imprisonment would not be satiating enough for the public. If Tuya Todoroki was a monster, then did Shoto's lack of hatred make him one too? It was a question that had only one right answer. Yes. He was taken away by a monster. Tuya wasn't the only devil in the family. Shoto thought that they were all a little unwell. Eri hugged him. Shoto patted her head until she let go. "I hope you win. And get better soon," she said. She loved fairy tales and stories of heroics. Midoriya had told him once. Happy endings were her favorite, where the protagonist prevailed against every scathing odd and every mighty obstacle, able to safeguard all of the people they held dear. Shoto knew about Eri's life before she was rescued by her knights in shining armor. Even in her young age, she knew that not every story ended that way. There were memories that left little more than failure to be wallowed in, and there were days that felt too long. Despite that, Shoto admired her optimism. "Everything will be worked out one way or another," he said, and he did not lie. Eri smiled through her tears. Shoto locked himself in the bathroom, very reminiscent of a midnight painting doused in hopelessness and dread. He sat next to the toilet, counting every fast-paced breath and clutching his hair with stiff fingers. When he lost track, he started over. He felt like he was suffocating and he didn't know why. There was no acceptable reason that a stranger in Natsuo's life should care so much or feel so broken over his death. The two rarely spoke as kids. Shoto figured that Natsuo held the same disdain for him that Tuya did and Fuyumi should have, but he let Shoto sit by his side and hold his hand in those last seconds. He smiled at him, he laughed. He rumpled Shoto's hair for the first and last time, comforting him. How could Natsuo care so much? Shoto grabbed his phone from his pocket. It rang once, twice, 3 times before she picked up. "Shoto, hey," Fuyumi said, her voice groggy and tired. He could imagine her clicking her lamp on and rummaging for her glasses. She came back. "It's kind of late, is everything all right?" "Yeah, I mean it's stupid, but I wanted to hear it from you." "Hear what?" Letting his legs unfurl, Shoto dipped his head back until it hit the wall. "Could you tell me about Natsuo?" Fuyumi didn't answer immediately. Shoto may have messed up horribly, but she didn't wait long enough for him to try and take back what he said. She had shifted her tone to the one that Shoto could never replicate, a soft feather falling from the sky and landing in a snowbed. "He loved you, Shoto. That's the first thing you should know." He was selfish asking it of her, but Fuyumi read a second eulogy back to him. He listened, closing his eyes and letting his chest grow steady on its own. The Todoroki siblings held a second funeral that night. One for just the two of them, and for the ghosts who happened to be listening. Izuku never regretted extending his hand out to Todoroki at the sports festival. Even as he laid in bed with fractured bones and torn ligaments because of it, sinking in the weight of his failure to win the tournament, It always remained a decision that he couldn't bring himself to look back on with a frown. To him, Todoroki had been one of the first people he saved. He drenched Izuku in sun-soaked flames and met him to hell, and Izuku couldn't have been happier with that. Stupid, naive Deku thought that the things Todoroki told him in the shadowy hallway were the only misfortunes occurring in his life. But eventually, Dabi revealed himself, and words had never tasted so revolting. In the days following Jaku, Todoroki had been withdrawn. It wasn't surprising. Their class gave him the space he needed and he soon returned to them, his eyes looking only a little more tired than before. Natsuo's death hadn't made Todoroki withdraw again. Izuku wished that it had, because then he could at least be coaxed back out again with enough time and consideration. But Todoroki wasn't withdrawn. He was absent. Whenever Todoroki entered a room, Izuku could see it clearer than crystal. He wouldn't call him the same person that he was at the beginning of the school year, like Uraraka or Kaminari had mentioned offhandedly and with sadness wrapping their words. Izuku didn't even recognize the Todoroki that stalked Yue's grounds. There was only one instance that Izuku could think of where Todoroki may have been angry with someone, but Ida had yet to say a word about what happened. Asking Todoroki himself had been a lost cause from the start, but Izuku had expected that. Sharing the rooftop brought some things to light that rattled his heart against his bones. There was no surprise upon hearing from Todoroki that he wasn't alright. Izuku would be more worried if Todoroki had said that he was fine. Everyone had limits, and Izuku knew that his friend was starting to reach his. Nothing he heard in that conversation startled him, but there were some things that scared him. One thing in particular. The silence. Izuku used to relish it. During the dog days of middle school, it reminded him that keeping his head above ground was still possible. The only voice he could listen to was his own, and it salvaged him. Todoroki's silence was devastating. It was terrifying. It told Izuku all of the things he didn't want to hear without forgiveness. His first attempt of drawing Todoroki out of the darkness that glazed over his eyes, he had ruined. He had pushed too hard and drove Todoroki further away, enough that he hadn't even turned around during Izuku's last-ditch effort to rekindle the spark that threatened to vanish. Luck had been on his side later that day when Eri and Mirio had visited the Heights Alliance to deliver her handmade cards. Todoroki had appeared better, though perhaps he had only gotten better at slipping behind his mask when he needed to. Eri seeing the bandages on his hand didn't help at all. Even while trying to comfort her, Todoroki's smile had never looked more painful. Izuku and Mirio had shared a glance, but they didn't dare say a word. Now, it was the next morning. Izuku continued keeping his eye out for Todoroki during classes. Nothing fell out of the ordinary, but a certain apathy clung to his friend relentlessly and never let go. Izuku couldn't do a thing about it. He wasn't the only one watching over him. Yaoyorozu and Kirishima approached him about how he thought Todoroki was doing, which was something he refused to lie about. "He's not okay," Izuku said, thinking back to the roof's rough pavement under his palms and the flare of orange that somehow peeled back the layers of Todoroki's facade to reveal the rain clouds that lived in his eyes. Yaoyorozu's lips thinned as she listened and Kirishima's face scrunched with commiseration. Izuku wasn't sure how close Todoroki was with either of them, only knowing him to have interacted with Yaoyorozu during their exam against Aizawa-sensei, and he recognized the natural friendliness that Kirishima possessed never being wasted on Todoroki. Neither shared the same friendship with him that Izuku did, but both cared about him just as much. "There's gotta be something we can do for him," Kirishima said, fiercely rocking his knuckles together. In his brain, Izuku stroked the words, trying to add a bit of magic to the trick that Kirishima had given him. It was a challenge. Every attempt seemed to end in abject failure. They had not a clue what happened behind closed doors, or whether any of their sentiments truly got through to Todoroki or simply spilled out of his ears the moment he heard them. "And," Kirishima added, more hesitant, "I've been meaning to ask. Did something happen between him and Ida? I feel like he's been kinda distant with him, especially." He paused. "Well, more distant than usual, that is." Izuku bit his cheek, flicking his eyes from one foot to the other as he walked. "I've noticed that as well," Yaoyorozu said. "Perhaps they're arguing about something? I guess. But they're friends, right? It's kinda unlike Ida to get into fights at all, let alone only a day after one of them comes back from, Yaoyorozu looked over at Izuku. What do you think, Midoriya? You're quite close to both of them. Izuku wondered, if he did know what happened between the two, would he tell them? Speculating felt wrong, yet the eagerness to help gnawed at him. Todoroki's withering tone, telling Izuku briskly that it wasn't his concern, struck him down like lightning every time he opened his mouth to theorize. He shook his head at Yaoyorozu and Kirishima. Until one of them comes to us, I don't think we should make their business our business. Let's just leave it alone for now. Neither of them looked very pleased with that answer. Izuku couldn't blame them. He, too, would have liked to do whatever it took to make both Ida and Todoroki happy, but there were some things that needed to be fixed without any unwanted outside help. That natural instinct that they were honing, one that told them to save as many people as possible, applied even to their friends, no matter how much they figured it shouldn't. Your instinct is wrong. Izuku found it funny. It had never been wrong before. From agreeing to follow a detached boy through the sports festival's halls to looking down at a little girl covered with bandages and distress in the mouth of an alleyway, Eri's eyes had been wide and shining with unrivaled fear while Todoroki's snowy glare had blown chips of ice into Izuku's heart. Etched into both of their gazes were the same desperate cries for help that neither could recognize on their own. Izuku thought that he had saved them, but only one could still greet him with a smile. The other had been torn away, and with every attempt to grasp onto him, he pulled further and further back, only getting harder and harder to see underneath the sheets of frost. Your instinct is wrong is what he thought before the reminder. Before the panic with every passing minute that he didn't see Todoroki in the morning, restraining himself from going to knock on his door and only letting his wound-up breath go when he finally got to see the scarlet and ghost hair, Izuku thought, your instinct is wrong. Kirishima's shoulders drooped. I feel bad for not leaving it alone, but I also feel bad for leaving it alone. Does that make any sense? Before Izuku could reply, Yaoyorozu nodded. It's a precarious situation. She tilted her head forward, inky hair spilling in front of her face. I don't exactly want to leave it alone, either. Todoroki is the one who helped give me a foundation to rebuild my own self-esteem, so I almost feel a certain debt to him. That being said, she looked at Izuku, a sadness peeking through her. I think you're right. We'll wait and see what happens. Okay. There was no argument to be made with that, though concern still prickled underneath Izuku's skin. He didn't like feeling helpless. He didn't like being able to stand next to Todoroki but sense no one beside him, a smile looking more agonizing on his face than a frown, and his goddamn silence yelling at Izuku while they stood atop one of the highest buildings on campus. We're gonna get this right, Kirishima said as they approached their classroom. All of us will make sure of it, yeah? The fervent words weren't derived from a place of ignorance, Izuku thought. Kirishima knew of death. Just like Yaoyorozu did and just like Izuku did. They all knew death, and they all knew how unpredictable and avoidable it can be. Death could be avoided if they kept their eyes open and looked for the signs. Izuku would be there looking for the signs. He would not be helpless. Yaoyorozu smiled, and to her credit, it barely wavered. Yeah, we will. It was easier to believe them, so that's what he did. When the final class of the morning let out, Izuku hastily found and fell into step alongside Todoroki. His strides were much longer and faster than Izuku's, almost as though he was avoiding something. Todoroki, hey. Izuku grinned, and Todoroki didn't spare him a glance. He made a small hum of acknowledgement, which Izuku snatched as a cue to keep going. We missed you at lunch the other day, sorry about that. Apologies. I didn't want to be in the cafeteria. No need to be sorry. Izuku assured as quickly as he could, trying not to let his smile crumble in front of Todoroki's jaded air. It was harder than it used to be, but Izuku would make sure that his stubborn determination outlasted Todoroki's defiance. He stretched his grin wider. You were in the courtyard then, I'm assuming. Mind if we join you this time? Todoroki finally looked at him, adding a deeper frown to his confused face. You want to join me outside? Izuku backpedaled horrendously. If you want to be alone, that's totally fine. Because well, obviously none of us want to make you uncomfortable or anything, but it'd be fun, don't you think? Fun. Todoroki tasted the word like it was grossly sour, but his expression remained stoic. He scratched just underneath his scar as he walked, keeping his eyes lowered. It was a habit that Izuku knew meant he was deep in thought, deep enough that he tended to zone out and ignore the bustling world around him. Izuku picked through the hallway for both of them, making sure no one bumped into Todoroki and Todoroki didn't bump into anyone. Finally, he swallowed and looked up. "Do what you want. I don't mind." "Great." Izuku strained, burying away his previous hope for a more enthusiastic response. He had to work for that, and he clearly wasn't there yet. "I'll get you something from the cafeteria, we'll all meet you there." "Don't bother," Todoroki said with a huff. "I'm not hungry." His face immediately softened with guilt as he looked away. "But I appreciate the offer. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have snapped at you like that." Izuku shook his head. "I didn't see it that way. I'll get you a granola bar, just in case." Todoroki only repeated what he had said earlier, but his voice was less rough. "Do what you want." He failed to realize that Izuku didn't want to be buying food for a friend who was growing skinnier by the day. It only saddened him to know that Todoroki meant it when he said he wasn't hungry, but Izuku would buy food anyway, even if it would all end up in the trash can by the end of the day. Was it worth it? Izuku liked to think that eventually, it would be. If he gave it time, maybe all of it would be worth it. In that case, he didn't mind getting Todoroki food that would remain uneaten. He hoped that the sentiment was appealing enough. "We'll meet you there, Todoroki," Izuku said, and Todoroki took his leave without a sound. Izuku watched him disappear around the corner the same moment Uraraka bounced up to him. "Are we getting food or what?" she said, tilting her head in the direction that Izuku was looking. "Yeah," he replied. "I just told Todoroki we'd all join him in the courtyard. Is that all right with you?" "Totally. Some fresh air will be nice, and I haven't talked to Todoroki at all today either." She stopped, her eyes losing some of their light as she hesitated. Slowly she asked, "So, how is he?" A vice tightened around his tongue, but Izuku only let out a low sigh. "He's not eating, he's definitely not sleeping, and he's got fresh bandages over his hand. He looks..." His breathing hitched as he caught himself from saying dead. "Drained." Uraraka covered her mouth with her hand, her face paler than nausea could ever make her. "You don't think he..." "It's not our place to say," Izuku cut her off, but he also didn't rule it out of the realm of possibility. Though it was less obvious than the white wrapping, he had also noticed the cuts on the tips of Todoroki's fingers and could come up with no explanation behind them. It was as though he had rubbed them against jagged, uneven stone until they bled. "You're right," Uraraka winced. "My bad. No speculating." They dropped the topic with uncomfortable silence. Both were thinking the same thing, but neither of their thoughts would ever come to fruition. Instead of speaking, they joined Ida and Tsuyu inside of the cafeteria where they informed them of Izuku's decision to join Todoroki outside. For the smallest moment, Izuku saw the apprehensiveness in the rigid lines on Ida's face, but he turned away and it was gone, like it was never there in the first place. Izuku didn't see it again. When he finally stepped into the sun's rays outside, Izuku had to shield his gaze from the harsh contrast of the school's cool light compared to nature's blindingly bright gleam. The heat soothed his unreasonably jittery nerves. The courtyard itself surprised him. When he saw it, he understood why Todoroki had chosen that place in particular to retire for the PRD. The soft splashing of the birdbath was a calm melody to listen to, and the chirping of robins and jays from high in the trees made him smile. Izuku had never been to the courtyard before. He had never had any reason to. Hero work and training kept him busy during the day, and during the night, he was stuck studying or winding down in his room. Suffice it to say, he regretted not exploring the school's campus earlier. There were surely other hidden gems, like the roof at the break of dawn, that he was ignorant to. He saw Todoroki sitting behind the large bushes of honeysuckle, kneeling on the ground in front of a small stone pond. When Izuku stood over his shoulder, he noticed the lack of fish and overabundance of plants and leaves that had fallen from trees. "You have one like this at your house, right?" Izuku said. Todoroki jumped with a start, a tiny wisp of fire appearing and disappearing on his hair for a fraction of a second before dissolving into the wind. He stood, brushing himself off with strict hands and a stricter frown. Yes, I do. I remember seeing it out the window of your house, that's all. Because of Todoroki's less than impressed face, Izuku left the conversation behind him and scratched his neck. When Uraraka and Tsu called them over to a nice patch of grass, Izuku covertly handed Todoroki the granola bar he promised him, and even without his peripheral, he knew that it had been put neatly into a pocket to be fed to the garbage can later that day. He ignored it. Todoroki! Uraraka grinned. Long time no talk? Only been a day, he replied, and Izuku stifled a startled laugh at the incredibly in-character statement. What startled Izuku more was how much it warmed him to hear Todoroki melt, even a little bit, back into his old habits. If it didn't last, then it didn't last, but it was still relieving. I wanted to ask, Tfue interjected, not allowing for any lull in conversation to take hold. What were you working on during the beginning of training yesterday? From what I could see, it didn't look familiar. Izuku leaned forward, interested in what Todoroki's answer would be. He hadn't been able to put his finger on it exactly yet. I had to do something more contained than that of the rest of you. It was about using my quirk in small doses at a time during close-quarters combat. The mere easygoing talk of training pulled Ida in like fish on a hook, and though he still shot Todoroki the most noticeable of glances, nothing ever came of it. Todoroki simply pretended he didn't exist. I only saw snippets, but you were using your ice incredibly precisely. Todoroki was very interested in the grass. Oh yeah, I saw that. Uraraka added. Using your ice like a sudden platform to trap Nijire's foot was clever. Izuku nodded along, sheepishly getting his notebook out and flipping to the small strips of notes he was able to take privately after the session. Uraraka gave him a teasing nudge and he felt his ears burn. It looked pretty advanced, if I'm being honest, he said earnestly. Being able to control your quirk in a fast-paced, confined environment like that is really impressive. Nijire did it to me first, so she showed me how, Todoroki explained, his neck still craned and facing the ground. I didn't realize anyone was watching, he muttered. I think everyone stopped to watch at some point. Tsu poked at a dimple in her cheek as her eyes followed the clouds that drifted above them. I'm surprised you didn't notice. When gusts of chills skidded across Izuku's arms and made his nose run, he looked at Todoroki, who was on his left. Teardrops of frost glistened on Todoroki's hair, only visible because of the sun's glare beating down on them, and every time patches of ice appeared on his neck, they melted away and were replaced. He was scratching his forearm with his nails, nicked in ice, the red marks starting to puff on his skin. You know what? Izuku said loudly, clasping his hands together and waiting patiently until Todoroki's attention diverted to him instead of his arms. We should have a movie night, just the 5 of us. This Friday it'll be fun. Ida shifted in place, but didn't raise any complaints. Todoroki remained neutral, and Izuku didn't trust either of them. I'll go, Ida said at last, tucking his lunch into a paper bag and rolling it up. It's good to relax every now and then, especially with friendly faces. Izuku smiled in relief, eventually looking over to his left. Todoroki? There wasn't much of anything in Todoroki's eyes that betrayed his true feelings towards the suggestion. He regarded Izuku carefully, inclining his head and rubbing his thumb under his scar. With a cool glance at Ida, Todoroki nodded tentatively. All right. Yay! Uraraka cheered, throwing her fists up in triumph. Everyone laughed, and not even Todoroki could chase away a smile, however small it was. Izuku noticed, but he wasn't sure anyone else did. When the laughter subsided, it was already gone, but Izuku still flipped to the last page of his notebook with a pencil in hand. Times Todoroki has smiled since. After all, a victory was a victory, no matter how small. Shoto was not on the roof. He was not on the roof, he was not in the courtyard, he was not outside. He was in the kitchen, hunched over at the counter and with the side of his head resting against the cold marble. His eyes were closed, and perhaps he was asleep at first glance, but his breath was too uneven to fool anyone paying attention. Shoto was tipsy on the moonlight, basking in silver darkness that kept his dreams thin enough to slip right through his hands and into the void, unretrievable and unwanted. Though he was not wandering in any dreamland, he creaked an eye open and looked out the window that illuminated the common room. UA's vast campus was less than a silhouette, fireflies twinkling and the occasional plane's flashing lights blending in with the stars. The night was warm and put all of the squirrels and deer outside to rest, but Shoto, inside and bundled in his oversized sweater, was too warm. He wasn't sure why his beating heart refused to be swallowed. His lungs were constricting and contorting, but he didn't make a sound. He only pressed his baggy sleeves into his eyes and willed them to stay dry. He could have used his quirk to cool himself off, but maybe there was some comfort in the uncomfortable heat that he didn't want to let go of. It felt as though a pair of arms were wrapped around his shoulders, so similar to what he imagined a brother would do to a younger sibling to make them smile. Shoto didn't smile. Natsuo had smiled. Shoto had cried. Blood and tears mixed together to create an agony that seared through both of them, burning Shoto's heart and Natsuo's life to ashes. The floorboards creaked, but only Shoto's eyes moved. They darted towards the sound and stayed there, stuck on the black hallway. A tall figure emerged, rubbing at bare eyes and freezing when they turned their head up to stare at Shoto. "Todoroki," Ida rasped, squinting even while he placed his glasses back on. "You're up very late." "So are you." They left it at that. Shoto did, at least. He put his head back down but watched through his hair Ida round the counter and opened the fridge. The sharp light stung and made him look away. Ida wasn't making tea like Shoto thought he would start doing, but he pulled out a carton of milk and 2 glasses. "Would you like some?" he asked. Shoto swallowed, trying to wash down the rocks in his throat on his own. "No." The milk was poured into the glass, but Ida only swirled it around and stared at it, his glasses resting nervously on the tip of his nose. Both of them had snakes wrapped around their shoulders and birds in their eyes, ready to flee at any moment. Shoto was about to raise his wings. "I'm sorry. I'm truly sorry." Shoto almost scoffed. They were going in such an endless circle with this. "For my loss." "No," Ida murmured, looking up at him. Shoto found it difficult to glare at the tire and guilt that so clearly racked the boy in front of him. "I'm sorry for what I told you when you came back to school. It was wrong of me to talk about my own trauma and you didn't deserve it." It was hard not to remember the fury that swarmed him when Ida had told him that in the empty stairwell. Shoto couldn't replicate it now, and he didn't feel he wanted to. There were so many grudges that Shoto held, so many people that he despised. People that, if fate had rolled the dice a little more to the right, he should have loved without reserve. Endeavor, because if he had been a hero, then villains wouldn't have been created and sons would be alive. Dabi, because if he had stayed dead, then Natsuo wouldn't be, and Shoto knew that his own friends would sleep more peacefully at night. Tuya, because he didn't know when to keep his mouth shut and how to quit. He hated Rei because she chose her dead children over her living ones. He hated Fuyumi because she never had to feel a chest stop rising or wash someone else's blood off her hands, never stopping until the soap had made her skin red and painful yet still drenched to the bone. And he hated Natsuo, because why did he get to be the one to die? Why did he leave Shoto and his family spiraling with no endpoint? But Shoto wasn't sure he really hated any of them. Because, above all, the person he hated the most was himself. That was too much hatred for him to hold alone. He just wanted to forgive someone. Ida stood and waited while Shoto raised his head. "It's okay. I shouldn't have yelled at you either." "I deserved it," he laughed weakly, the humor far removed from his voice. "I still have a lot to learn about how to handle other people's emotions, not just my own. I'll do better, Todoroki. I promise." Shoto didn't smile, but he tilted his head forward in patience. "I believe you." Slowly, his gaze gravitated towards the unused second glass that hadn't been put away. He sighed. "I think I will have some milk too, if it's not any trouble." Ida's eyes brightened up and his shoulders loosened, his hands jerking with surprise. "Yes. It's no trouble at all." As he fumbled with the container and glass, Shoto waited for him to spill or drop something, but he never did. The milk itself was cold and tasteless, but it washed away the rocks in his throat and Shoto didn't want to find a reason to complain. "If you need some help falling asleep," Ida told his half-listening ears, "you could warm it up." Shoto leaned his hand on his forehead, over his blemished and red skin, and trailed a finger around the rim of the glass. The thought of flames sent him back into time to pale, spiked hair. He couldn't see anything except sapphire, even Tuya's grinning face blurry against the tears and heat. Shoto's own orange power was drowned out and devoured with seeming ease, nothing more than child's play compared to Tuya. "It's fine," he muttered, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "I already have something from Recovery Girl." Though he didn't like nor even want to admit it, he kept the bottle of gummy pills in the very back corner of his desk, hidden from sight and from mind, but not quite gone. "Oh, the melatonin gummies. I believe most of us use those too. Have you been taking them for a while?" Shoto stared at him. "I've never had one in my life." But Ida trailed off, scrunches of confusion appearing on his forehead. "That is, if you don't mind my asking why?" "I don't like medication," Shoto lied, not even a twitch giving himself away. Sick of lies as he was, there were some necessary evils that he could conquer. "It makes me nervous." That was true at the very least. Not everything that left his mouth had to be silver. Not a drop of acceptance on Ida's face for what he'd heard could be seen, but it wasn't judgment, either. Shoto offered him a shrug of his own. "A lot of my family does use it, just not me." And ever since the night he spent in a bathroom, a broken pill bottle in his scratched-up hand and curled up alone until he heard the first whistle of morning, he'd never had any longing to use them again. Even now, he could still feel his skin ripping as he tore the bottle open, not taking any time to look inside before pulling it up to his mouth. He could have died that night, if his conviction had been stronger. It was nothing short of luck, fate, or perhaps his own sick will to live that he still stood. A will to live? No, it wasn't that at all. Shoto didn't have a will. At best, he had a flimsy reason, and sooner or later it would prove to be not good enough, because when something happened to her, he preferred not to think about it. Ida took Shoto's empty glass and offered to pour another cup. Shoto shook his head. "Obviously," Ida said quietly, "I will never chastise you for not taking medication. It's far from my place to dictate what you do with your life, but I do hope that you wouldn't think of yourself as weak for possibly needing it." "Well, I'm fine, anyway." "There's no need." The clunky and uncharacteristic response didn't go unnoticed. Ida's swift recovery from his pause at the refrigerator was proof of it. Shoto pulled away from his seat at the counter. "I'm going to go back to my room now," he said, getting to his feet. "Thank you for the milk, Ida." "No, thank you's necessary, Todoroki. Anything for a friend. You know that, right?" It made Shoto shift his gaze away, but he nodded. "Yes, I know." He edged towards the hallway, waiting for the tide to pull him down. "Why wouldn't I?" Ida didn't respond. He tried to grin, but Shoto didn't react. Have a good night, Todoroki." "You too, Ida." Shoto allowed himself to melt back into the shadows, but drowsiness was not arriving when he closed his room's door behind him. He hadn't unpacked the way others thought he did. No one had stepped foot into his room, so they didn't see the clothes sprawled and scattered on the ground, on his bed, on chairs, and hanging from hazardously open drawers. Picking his way through empty bottles of water and shirts that were no longer clean, he tripped over his ankle and almost fell against the wall, but caught himself on the corner of the desk instead. His skull pounded as his eyes dropped in and out of focus. When was the last time he'd actually slept more than an hour at a time? It was impossible to recall, but his bed began to look sweeter than wine. Shoto plucked the bottle of melatonin that Recovery Girl had so graciously handed him, spells of unease rocking his core and dipping him into a pool of conflict. Unscrewing the cap, he dropped one of the gummies into his hand and stared at it. Not even the whole bottle would be enough to kill him, the label had said. There wasn't any reason to be so pathetically nervous, like Ida now knew him to be. Shoto didn't take medication for anything, but for only one night, just one. He wanted to sleep. He wanted to forget. He wanted to go numb. He tipped his head back and swallowed. Shoto sat on the top of a sweeping hill, looking out into the bare ground below him. It was a valley of stone, stretching further than he could see with his bare eyes. Fog and smoke swirled ominously, floating towards the sky and beginning to drain the clouds. A single barren tree was all that was left of any natural wildlife. A few leaves still clung to thin and trembling branches, but one gust of wind would be all it took. Someone sat next to him, but Shoto couldn't turn his head. All he could see was feathery white hair blowing gentle against the breeze, and was left to tortuously assume. I like it here, Shoto. It reminds me of the garden. Did it resemble the garden? The wasteland beneath them and the stench of thick fire reminded Shoto more of the battlefield, his abhorred second home. And you know, Shoto, I was thinking, why are you calling me that? Natsuo stopped mid-breath, tilting his head to the side as he looked at Shoto. Because that's your name and I'm your brother. It's just, Shoto shrugged. You never call me that. What then? Natsuo's voice was blank. All of its soft edge was gone, and Shoto was reminded. What does he call you? Sho. Just Sho. Okay, Sho. Not you, he snapped, but the strength wasn't there. You can't call me that. I just figured if you were going to be my brother, it's something you would know. I'm sorry. Shoto gave a dead laugh. No, you're not. You're not real. Natsuo hummed as if he was content with that. I'm not real. Wouldn't that be nice, though? If I were. The fire was coming closer. It ripped through the sky and engulfed the clouds, but most impossibly, it was eating the rocks themselves. It would be nice if you were real, Shoto agreed. But I'm not. But you're not. Natsuo and Shoto sat on the edge of that hill for a while. The sky changed, sometimes warping into blue fire that could only be stared at with thrill and terror, and other times turning into the ceiling that Shoto had fixed his tired eyes on while laying on his back in the middle of a training room. The weeds in the dirt tickled his hands. Shoto curled his fingers into the ground until pins and needles embedded themselves in. Are you ever going to wake up? Natsuo asked, and Shoto blinked slowly. The horizon's end was appealing, even as it burned sapphire. I want to stay like this, he said. For only a little longer. They're waiting. They can wait. Natsuo stood up. He sighed. I know they can, but you can't. Now wake up, Shoto. Look at him without flinching or you'll be joining him sooner than you think. It was so loud. The fire crackled and roared, but it was drowned out by sharp, clear-cutting words right next to his ear. They were so casual, so matter-of-fact. That was why they hurt so much. But you're never going to face him, Shoto. And you know why that is. Shoto closed his eyes, but he could still see everything. All of the destruction and despair was still visible. There was no running away. It's because you're a coward. He opened his eyes. I know, Natsuo. Did you visit his grave? No. Did you go up to the casket? No. Did you even say goodbye? Shoto's voice was strangled as he looked straight ahead. No. You had a chance. He was in your arms and you had a chance. So many options, but you chose none of them. You made one last empty promise right before he slipped away, the ugliest promise of all, life. Then you betrayed him by taking that away too. He must have been so scared. Only 19. Just a kid. I know. Shoto knew that. He had thought about it so much he should have gone mad by now. He should have already shattered the ice on top of him and climbed out to a mind-taking silence, and he should have already freely plunged himself back into darkness to escape it. Shoto, Natsuo said. Through tears, Shoto replied, What? Look up. The smoke had arrived, so close that Shoto reached out his hand and grasped at the dissolving tendrils. He did as he was told and craned his neck back. He expected an azure inferno to be reaching down for him. In a way, that was what he got. Grotesque, wrinkled scars wrapped around what may have been a face. Stitches of silver held the man together, and his eyes crinkled as an evil smile peered down at Shoto. You're next. Tuya laughed, and the world exploded before he could scream. Shoto woke with a soaked face, gasping and trembling as he clutched his sheets. Once more, he stumbled from his bed, grabbing his pills and trying to make his way to the bathroom. He stood over the toilet, quietly unscrewing the cap. He stared at them. With a quick flush, the entire bottle was gone in seconds, and Shoto closed the door behind him. He didn't need medication. When Shoto stepped out of his final class that day, he could hear the school breathing. His brain latched onto every conversation as he passed it, yet he couldn't retain any of the scraps in his head. Everything was too cloudy. Though he had gotten a full night's rest, he had never felt more awake in those nightmares that lasted eternities. Memories usually replayed in his mind to replace dreams, but those godforsaken pills had given him something much more creative than that. Real nightmares. It was such a fine line, that of fantasy and reality. He thought that sleeping would be empty and unfeeling and nice, an escape from his own head. That was his own mistake. He couldn't expect to get away from quicksand by diving deeper into quicksand. Shoto put one foot after the other, just like he'd always learned to do when the waters turned dangerous. He wasn't sure if he loathed his own toxic headspace for turning UA into another minefield, or if he loathed the fact that that really was what he continued walking into every day. He hated slipping around every corner and expecting Tuya to greet him with the flick of a flaming wrist, not even realizing that Tuya had no chance of ever getting inside. That didn't stop Shoto from showing up to the one classroom that provided what he remembered as solace, questions heavy in his mouth. "Todoroki," Aizawa-sensei said, surprise tinting his face. "You're still here." Shoto tugged his tie, wondering if it was too tight around his neck. "How secure is it?" His teacher's spine straightened, and Shoto thought he could see his capture weapon twitch. He took an unconscious step back. "Very," Sensei answered, his voice stern and resolute. He didn't need to know what Shoto was talking about to truly know. "And if somehow the security fails, then I'll do whatever I have to in order to keep you and your class safe." Shoto stared at the eye patch and marks that littered his face, the thick white scar that wrapped underneath his eye. A hero who sacrificed their mind and body for the sake of people he barely knew was a concept that Shoto had grown faintly familiar with in his growing years, his only real model being All Might himself. Seeing it for himself, being taught under that kind of hero, left him with sinking ideas. How does one teach that kind of heroism? It had to be something people are either born with or not. It was almost like a slap in the face, being taught by Eraserhead after Natsuo's death. Shoto wasn't born with it. "I appreciate that, sensei," he said, rubbing his palm and missing the bandages that had covered it. Recovery Girl had been happy to take those off and point out the barely distinguishable amount of color that had returned to his face. Shoto forced himself to look in the mirror afterward, but he couldn't see what she did. The only thing that looked more noticeable was his cracked and dark scar, his blood-red hair, and his eyes that were rimmed permanently with eye bags. Class pretty boy had never been more of an insult. "Todoroki," Sensei said, "do you feel safe at UA?" "Yes," Shoto responded immediately, and in his haste almost overlapped with Sensei before he even finished his question. "Yes, I feel safe. I know I can protect myself." Sensei's face was an anchor at the bottom of the ocean. Instead of angry, as Shoto had last seen him, he looked resigned, and maybe a little bit sad. "Respectfully," he told Shoto, "I don't like that answer. You're not supposed to protect yourself, we're supposed to protect you. And we're going to." "But there are some people you can't protect," Shoto said in a low voice. Not accusatory, but a difficult observation. There are some people who need to be protected, but aren't. He hung his head, shrugging. "What do you do about those people?" There were so many who fell under that category. Natsuo, his mother. Tuya hadn't been protected from absorbing the same passion and longing that Endeavor modeled for him. He was too young. He never would have been able to handle it. Shoto hadn't been able to handle it either. All of it warped into hatred, buried deep inside and never let out. He kept it there for a long time, long enough that it lost sight of its target and turned on Shoto. It almost devoured him whole too, just like Tuya. The only difference was that Shoto had been saved, or something similar to it. It was a short-lived relief before he was thrown back into the wolf's den, just to get ripped apart one more time and stitched back together. He missed the anger. It had given him a reason to keep going, if it had done anything at all. "What do you do about the people you couldn't protect?" Sensei repeated, and he took a slow breath, thinking and considering the words that he must have thought he knew the reason behind. There was someone he had in mind as he reflected, Shoto could tell. He had come to recognize the longing in even the hardest of faces. Sensei was a hero, so it simply came with the job. Aizawa-sensei shrugged back at him. All you can do is remember them. You can take them with you while you move forward, but you can't let them stop you. Shoto dug his nails into his palms. That's all I can do? And damn it, Shoto knew he was in the wrong, but he needed something better than that. Tia, Mum, Natsuo, they deserved something better than that. Who cares about memories? All they served to be were knives that stabbed him in the back, in the eyes, in the heart. They were moments that would never be recreated or made anew, only scorning him the longer they lived in his head. Shoto glared at him. Sensei watched him. No one likes that answer, but I've never changed it for anyone, he said. I don't plan on starting. Shoto shouldn't be so emotional over that kind of response either. It was the rational one that was to be expected from someone like Eraserhead. Besides, Sensei thought that he had only been asking about Natsuo, so it wasn't entirely his fault. Even so, what did he do about the lonely people who weren't living for themselves, but for someone else? The ugly people who were living to make sure one person never succeeded again? The patiently hysteric people who pretended that their world wasn't so bad, even after it beat them down and ripped their freedom right from their hands? The people who expected letters from dead sons and alive sons and didn't know why they weren't getting any from either? What did he do about the people who were still alive, but so shredded and broken and effed up inside that they wished they were dead? What did he do about that? Shoto cracked his knuckles, twisting and pressing them together until he could feel the sharp pain of two bones against each other. I don't even know how to stop. All I've ever done is kept moving because if I didn't, I wouldn't have survived. It's so tiring, Sensei, I'm so tired. He sighed, rubbing the bottom of his palms into his sockets and grasping his hair. Sorry, that was a useless thing to say. I guess what I'm asking is, red-rimmed eyes reluctantly greeted a bloodshot one. How do I grieve? Tell me what I'm doing wrong. Sensei didn't look away, which forced Shoto to do it himself. He could hear him shift in place, taking in the words that Shoto almost wanted to take back. Why do you think you're doing something wrong? Sensei asked. Because I'm not getting better. Just tell me what I can do to get better, Shoto pressed. I can't live not like this. Sensei lifted his hands, palms out, and it was confusing. It reminded him of something someone would do to confront a rabid dog. Todoroki, I need you to take one deep breath. In through your nose and out through your mouth as calmly as you can. When his teacher took a small step forward, Shoto took another step back, incidentally colliding with the door. His bag fell off his shoulder and into the crook of his arm. With messy hair and wrinkled clothing hanging from his frame, he probably did look like a seething animal. I don't need to calm down, Sensei. You have to give me something that works. Time didn't work, pills, they didn't work, nothing worked. So is it me? Is it something I'm doing? His voice dropped. He let his bag's sash drop into his hand and he touched the consequently raw skin with too much care. I don't know why I'm like this. I'm sorry. Dragging his gaze back up to Aizawa-sensei, he felt his chest swell with his breath, which he released through his mouth. I'm sorry, he repeated. Sensei didn't react. It almost surprised Shoto, but he knew that there wasn't much that Sensei hadn't seen. His teaching profession piled onto his daily patrols as a hero wasn't an attractive workload, so a whining child likely wouldn't be what he would rather spend his time focusing on, especially not when villains were running around unchecked in the city. Unclench your jaw, Todoroki. Shoto made a noise in the back of his throat. Why? You're tense. There was no judgment in those words, but even more staggering than that was the lack of apathy. Why did he never remember that Sensei cared? He was kind and he was tough, one never clearly outweighing the other in any situation. Right then, however, Shoto saw one of those traits starkly. In both his actions and his words, all he could find was sympathy and concern, and during it he could only think, where is Sensei? Until he realized, this is Sensei. This is your teacher. He had only ever witnessed this type of kindness from Sensei before, though, and always from a distance. He'd never received it. This is your teacher and he wants to help you. I need you to let me help you, Todoroki. Shoto unclenched his jaw. His mouth eased up. His eyes ached and he could feel the back of his tongue grow heavy. There you go, kid. Are you okay? There was no real way to describe it, but everyone had a breaking point. Only so many times could he hear the same question, over and over again, and only so many times could he tell them the same thing. His heart that had stopped beating, the one that had been tortured so badly and petrified into stone, cracked. But the door opened like a clap of thunder and Shoto violently flinched. "Shota!" Present Mike-sensei exclaimed, holding up a pile of marked worksheets. "Think you could look these over for me?" Shoto cleared his throat, slinging his bag back over his shoulder. Mike-sensei opened his mouth when he noticed him, but Shoto beat him to it. He turned to Aizawa-sensei. "Thank you for explaining those problems to me, I appreciate it." Sensei held a hand out. "Kid, I have to go anyway. Sorry for wasting so much time. See you Monday." Mike-sensei grinned, ignorant of the conversation that had just been held. Shoto fled down the hallway, biting back tears that never hit the ground. What a stupid idea. He should have known better. There was no room in Shoto's life for compassion or rest, not when he had to be kept on his toes so vigilantly. But he had let the wool be pulled over his eyes regardless, so it was his own deadly mistake. And such a stupid mistake it was. Who was he to think himself important enough to get a break in a time of crisis? So many people existed who deserved it more than him, who were fighting for their lives every single day and never complained about it. There were so many people that had already died who didn't deserve it, but Shoto was still standing. Why was he alive after everything he had done? After creating a monster of cerulean from his mere existence, after promising life to a dying boy, after ruining his sister's chance of getting her happy ending, after forcing his mother into a white-walled prison, he was the one who got to live. What was it that Sensei had said? All you can do is remember them. It was true. All Shoto could do was remember them, and every day he had to live with those memories that would never be created again. The sun still rose. The ocean still dragged. Natsuo was still dead, and Shoto was still alive. Nothing he did would ever fix that. Shoto rubbed his hand over his face, tilting his head back to stare at the Heights Alliance. He should go inside, nod at the words of consideration from his friends, and hide away for the rest of the day, just like his routine called for. It was simple, it was succinct, and it was expected of him. The conversation with Sensei echoed through his mind, never fading for long enough. Every word and stretch of silence lingered with him. He didn't want to look Sensei in the face again, not so soon. What had been seen of him was weakness, even if someone like Midoriya would tell him otherwise. Shoto had let himself fall apart, which he couldn't easily be forgiven for, nor should he be. It wasn't self-pity or wallowing that allowed him to believe it, but truth. Then Tsuyu approached him, and he bit his tongue so sharply he tasted metal. That wasn't to say he disliked Tsuyu, because he didn't. On the contrary, he quite liked her and her blunt honesty. He remembered at the USA how calm she had stayed, even as Shigaraki almost grabbed her face and broke her down to dust. Looking back, it was likely because of the shock and inability to process what had been happening that kept her still and saved her life, that, along with Aizawa-sensei's unnerving resilience, but it remained a moment of hers that he admired. With that being said, her honesty grated his nerves at times. In a way, she reminded Shoto of Nijire, though Nijire was more ignorantly curious than honest. So when Tsuyu opened her mouth, he braced himself. "You don't have to go if you don't want to." Shoto thought that he had his guard up, but she had slipped through it. He didn't have a clue as to what she was talking about. "I'm sorry." She crinkled her nose. "For what?" He stood there like a fool, unsure how exactly to respond. It was then that he finally realized that this was what Bakugo meant whenever he called him dense. "No, not like that," Shoto tried to amend. "What you said before, I don't know what you mean." Tsuyu blinked. "When we all agreed to sleep in the common room, all 5 of us. It's tonight." She put her finger against her cheek as Shoto winced. "You forgot." "That's fine." Her tone was far more indifferent than what sounded normal. He was unsure if it was a farce or not, perhaps even a ploy to get a rise out of him. One of Uraraka's sly tricks to get him to fully confirm his attendance instead of letting him back out at the last minute. In truth, he almost did back out. The words were sizzling on his tongue and his mouth was open, But then he remembered what exactly he would be going back to that night if he declined. Not only were his own physical shortcomings that took the form of sloppiness waiting for him, but his bed and dreams were waiting to continue. Shoto supposed that it was only some sort of sign that the one night he took pills to help him sleep resulted in him never wanting to close his eyes again. It was so dark in his room. He didn't like feeling as though someone with slick white hair drizzled in red was watching him from a window, watching him sleep. Smiling in that way he did, all teeth and no real happiness. Just sick pleasure and vile glee. He didn't want to go back yet. I didn't forget, Shoto said, keeping his hands still and tucked behind his back, out of sight. I've had other things on my mind is all. Tsuyu nodded as she brushed his arm while passing him. If you say so, Todoroki. I believe you. Her face broke out into a smile then and she waved. See you later. Shoto felt his own hand raise. He waved back. Yeah. See you. When she left him standing in the hallway, he did his best to ignore the strange fuzziness that bloomed in his chest, and he disregarded the real reason why he told Tsuyu that he hadn't forgotten about their soon-to-be night in the commons. In a bad way he felt, but he disregarded that, too, for his own sake. The good would leave soon enough, and he'd rather deal with the fallout now than later. Shoto turned his back on the Heights Alliance. There was someone else he wanted to see. The parents' dormitory was more hushed than one, as could ever hope to be. Even while Shoto slipped noiselessly past the group of people milling about in the lounge, they were more contained than his friends. It reminded him of his childhood, sneaking around and being less than silent because of how still everything in the house was. The smallest breath could be detected, so he held it. It wasn't hard, not with the years of practice ingrained into him and his movements. He could be a fly on the wall if he wanted to. Natsuo used to call it his second quirk, but never to Shoto's face. Fuyumi's room was easy to find. It was knocking that was the struggle. She didn't know that he was here. What if she didn't even want to see him in the first place? He should have told her he was coming. The door opened and Shoto fell back, catching himself on the wall behind him. I saw a shadow under the door, Fuyumi said with a small smile, but no footsteps. Who else could it have been? Right? He murmured, stepping inside with her authority. Her room was so much cleaner than Shoto's, he wanted to GG. She could keep herself afloat in her everyday responsibilities, so Shoto didn't have an excuse. Perhaps rudely, he moved towards the window without any other words of greeting to study the small Polaroid photos taped to the glass. The only photos he could remember having taken were mandatory ones for school or for endeavor, not for personal use. Oh, but there he was, just a child swaddled in a blanket and hugging his mother's neck while she looked down at him, laughing. Natsuo was on his toes trying to look at Shoto but not being quite tall enough. The photographer's hand was blurry in favor of the rest of them, but he could tell that they were making a peace sign. Fuyumi must have taken it. The one next to it was of Fuyumi, Natsuo, and Tuya, crouching beside a large puddle and putting leaves on it, oblivious to the snapshot. Perhaps Rei had taken that one. Was Mom into photography? Shoto asked, bending slightly to get a better look at another picture. Fuyumi stood next to him. No, not that I know of. These were all taken on phones, so the quality isn't the best. She leaned against the window, staring at every box that was frozen in time with a certain longing that Shoto couldn't replicate. He was barely present for most of these, or was far too young to remember them. Shoto could tell that if Fuyumi were able to reach back into one of those moments and live there forever, she would do it in a heartbeat. He couldn't blame her, he would do it too, because even though his childhood was a dead zone, there were good moments that he wouldn't have been able to experience without it. The tranquilizing touch of his sister's cold fingers over burnt skin. His brother's not-so-good pep talks after a hard day that made him want to laugh and cry and hug him and hit him. The oceans that he used to be able to find in his eldest brother's quirk, unsure if he would ever be able to make something as appealing as that. Maybe that was why forgiveness was so impossible to navigate. Shoto didn't really care about what happened to him because of endeavor. He cared about what happened to his siblings. Everything he cherished was inside of them, and nearly all of it had been taken away before he realized what was going on. It made him feel powerless. Endeavor made him feel powerless after giving him such a powerful quirk, and that was what hurt most of all. What are you doing here, Shoto? Fuyumi asked, like it was a tired accusation. Shoto didn't look away from the pictures, but he watched her from his peripheral. What do you mean? She smiled in the way that didn't reach her eyes. Something about her looked forced. As much as I want to believe it's because my little brother wants to spend time with me, I know you, and I know it's not that. That's fine, too, I don't mind actually. So tell me how I can help you. Fuyumi was a good sister. He loved her, but he didn't trust her to leave him alone if she saw that. I'm fine, Fuyumi. There's nothing you can do. She didn't reply. Shoto didn't say anything. She didn't reply until she did. Then are you here just to mock me? Shoto blinked, snapping out of the daze he didn't know he was in. He stared at Fuyumi, who didn't look surprised by her own words, only guilty. She had her fingers over her mouth and was looking at her carpet. To what? I don't understand anything, Shoto, she said slowly, helplessly. I don't understand why you haven't visited Mom, why you suddenly think no one can help you, why you think I'm going to abandon you. I don't understand how you aren't dead with all of this in your mind. Shoto was stunned. What the hell does any of that have to do with me mocking you? Because you aren't letting me do anything about it. You come to me all the time but don't let me stay, and I feel like I'm going crazy every time I see you. God, Shoto, just let me help you, please. I don't need help, Fuyumi, he flared, snatching his hands away from her unbearably cold ones. Why did every single person in his life think they held any power over him? He wanted to be fixed, not crushed. Not again. He should have left it at that, but it was all boiling over now. It just so happened that Fuyumi, the one person he trusted more than himself, was in his line of sight. Life was screwed up like that. You know, I'm so sorry that you can only see Natsuo or goddamn Tuya when you look at me. Really I am. I noticed that, Fuyumi, that face you make when you think I can't see you. I noticed all of it. When Shoto attacked, he typically went for the throat. It was one of the most sensitive parts of the body and could incapacitate someone effectively enough. Snapping, slicing, choking, pounding, all of it could kill. Call him a snake for it, for that was what he was. Eating his own tail and living to regret it when he finished seemed to be a routine, however hideous. The smoke was getting closer. The darkness was pulling him down. Why was he still fighting in the first place? And you want to know why I haven't killed myself yet? He asked, and didn't wait for her to catch up. It's because of you. I don't give a shit about my life, I never did. I'm here because I don't know how you would react if I wasn't, and even though I would never find out, I still don't want to know. Understand now? You're the reason I'm mocking. Shoto. No, I'm talking Fuyumi. That's what you want me to do, so let me talk. I don't need any of your bullshit life advice that you feed to your students so you can feel like you didn't fail your family, because we all know that's why you actually got into teaching. Shoto stopped himself, scratching his arm to ground himself. He was going too far with this tirade. Ripping into his sister who had done nothing but show him support was cruel, but the words couldn't be taken back. They were hanging in the air, and no matter how much he wanted to shove them back into his mouth, they were out. Fuyumi was crying. His heart burned with shame. What was he even saying anymore? He was acting like every person he tried to run from but could never escape. I didn't know you felt that way, she whispered. I don't feel that way. I shouldn't have said it. But you did. But I did. I'm sorry. His eyes stung. He wiped at them. There was one person in the world he allowed himself to fall apart in front of. Himself. He was tired. He wanted to close his eyes and sleep for eternity, trying to do the impossible. Travel to a snowflake's edge or bottle stars like fireflies. He wanted to see him again. Once, just once, he wondered if having that audience he hated so much would be comforting. He wanted it to be someone to acknowledge that what just happened was real, not some figment of his imagination that he could shut his eyes to. He didn't want his emotions to feel impossible. Maybe that was why he finally cried. It was without tears, but they would come eventually, and when they did, Fuyumi was there to hold him close and dry them in the crook of her neck. She drummed her knuckles on his spine like he was a child, but he didn't shake her off. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. He told her everything without thinking. He told her about what he said to Ida his first night back under a roof that wasn't his own. He told her about both conversations he had with Sensei, and he told her about the way his mind refused to let him sleep even while he dreamed, and he told her about how he wanted to die so many times, even if she knew that already, because he needed to hear himself say it. He didn't tell her about the night in the bathroom where he edged the line of death so closely, he could feel it numb his body. She didn't need to know just how close she really did come to planning her youngest brother's funeral. They were on the ground. Shoto could feel the floor under his bent fingers, but he didn't know when he got there. "You don't want to die, Shoto," Fuyumi murmured into his hair, his voice breathy and whimpering. "You want to be okay." "What's the difference?" he asked, his words tripping on his sobs and muffled by Fuyumi's sweater. He didn't get an immediate answer, but he kept his eyes closed. His eyes were so wet. "We'll figure it out," she said. "It's okay, Shoto, we're gonna figure it out. I'm sorry. For everything. I'm sorry about everything I made you do for me." He didn't pull away from her shoulder, his anchor. "I'm sorry about what I said. I'm sorry about Mom, I'm sorry about Tuya, and I'm so sorry about Natsuo." "It's okay, Shoto." He felt her shaking her head. "It's not your fault. None of this is your fault." Carefully, never doing anything too suddenly, she detached him from her neck. "Do you believe me?" He was forced to look at her, and her face made Shoto hesitate. She was just as torn up inside as he was. Still an igloo with a fire going and a refusal to melt. How she did it was a mystery that Shoto once knew the answer to, but not anymore. He was different now, as was she, and he hated it. Staring at her, he knew that lying wasn't an option. The truth was harder to hear, but he couldn't lie. "No," he said, finally knowing how she felt at the funeral. It took so long to understand, but he thought that he finally did. He wanted to shatter. Fuyumi didn't let him. "I get it. It's hard. For now, then, for just a few minutes, trust me. Trust me when I tell you that none of what's happened to us is your fault. You didn't do anything wrong, Shoto." He swallowed, but the rocks didn't go down cleanly. "We're so fed up," he muttered. There was nothing else to say, and he supposed that was the point. She smiled tearfully and agreed. "I guess we are." When Shoto closed his door upon his return, he did not move. He looked at his mess that was beginning to pile up and felt like he was staring into the soul of his shortcomings. It struck him then. He did not feel better. He felt looser, but not lighter. There were still mountains crushing his chest and lungs, water still ripping him downward. He still couldn't breathe, even with Fuyumi now knowing every shrunken and miserable part of him that he almost tricked himself into thinking would null the pain. The pills were gone, but he could still feel them in his hand. He had never taken pills, but he could feel them clogging his throat and suffocating him. He wanted to cry again, but he wasn't safe. Not here. He tended to run whenever it got bad again, but there was nowhere in UA he wouldn't feel burdensome. The koi pond was far, far away. He could never reach it. Shoto slipped his shoes off as he stepped over. Piles of clothes and his suitcase he had yet to fully unload. To get his desk chair out, he needed to drag it over shirts and breathes, but he didn't care about them getting even dirtier. Not bothering with the lamplight, Shoto tried to stare at his school work in the dark through squinting eyes. There was beginning to be a trend when it came to school. He actively failed to pay attention, even when he tried, so he didn't have anything. He forced himself to complete worksheets that he didn't understand and write reports of topics he didn't care about. Come Monday, his teachers were going to give him their disappointed faces and tell him that at least he tried his best. Normally, Shoto would have rolled his eyes and moved on with his life. Now he knew that it was true. His old worst was his new best, and he was simply supposed to move on. To finish all of that off, he had wasted the rest of his afternoons stowing himself away in his filth. So that was where he stayed until the sky began to bleed and the moon hanged itself from the stars. It was a prison he created of his own flesh and bone, and he bound himself there. A knock at his door gave him an excuse to get up. Shoto had learned to expect knocks at any hour of the day, even nightfall. His friends had no time restrictions for their surprise visits. He opened the door barely a crack, not willing to let anyone in on the unprincipled state of his quarters. Ida would certainly balk at the sight alone, class representative and all. He couldn't possibly allow one of the top students to fall so far from grace. Shoto could have scoffed. "Hello," he said, wincing as he did so. His voice was scathing and sore, noticeable to anyone who could listen. "Hey," Uraraka replied, waving. Tsuyu tilted her head at him. He sighed. "You're right," he mumbled. "I forgot." She shrugged. "It's okay. We all kinda knew you would." That shouldn't have hurt him, but after recalling his talk with Tsuyu about him forgetting from that very same day, it burned. Midoriya held up a plate. "And because we kind of figured this was going to happen, we saved you a cupcake." He grinned at Shoto, bright as he always was. The treat was messily frosted with 2 different colors, white and red. In the middle was a small, unlit candle that was beginning to fall over. He gave them a smile. It was hard not to be endeared by their antics, however small they were. Ida frowned. "It was supposed to be lit, but we couldn't find a lighter." "Here." Shoto put his fingers around the tip of the candle, cautiously lighting it up. He kept his hand in front of him, blocking his eyes from glaring at his own fire. "Good. Great," Midoriya confirmed, now holding the plate up to him. Shoto didn't know what else they wanted him to do. He didn't appreciate having an open flame held up to his face, but that wasn't their fault. "You have to blow it out," Uraraka supplied helpfully. "But I just lit it," Shoto said. "Do you not wait for it to melt completely? And have wax drip onto the food?" Ida looked good-naturedly affronted. "That would be incredibly counterproductive to having just made the cupcake, Todoroki." Tsuyu croaked, which could have been a laugh. "Good point." Shoto lightly blew on the candle flame, extinguishing it quickly. They cheered and Shoto stepped out from his bedroom, closing his door so that no one got the chance to peek inside. "You're coming downstairs with us?" Midoriya asked, bouncing on his heels in anticipation. Hope gleamed in his face like the candle itself. Shoto was glad that he wouldn't be extinguishing that. "If that's all right, I think I need some air." "Yeah. We're gonna watch a movie or two, and we set up blankets, cushions, pillows, and stuff in the lounge." Midoriya tried to hand Shoto the cupcake, but with one taste of the frosting, he decided that he did not like cupcakes. "That bad, huh?" Uraraka teased. Shoto coughed into his arm, trying to freeze his tongue and get the sharp sweetness washed out. "No," he rasped, but no one believed him. The smell of popcorn and burnt batter wafted through the room, and Shoto wanted to throw up. All of it was simply too much, but he pushed down his thrashing disgust and sat on the couch, pulling a blanket over his legs. Holding his breath was a solution, albeit not a practical one. The only thing he could do was wait and hope that he didn't find himself stuck between 2 hells, that of his room and his friends. Shoto distracted himself with the movie. It wasn't very fascinating, so he paid too much attention to the little details that didn't matter, ultimately making his viewing experience very different from the others. As they talked about it, Shoto detached. He rested his head on the couch's arm and stared at the ceiling, nodding along to what Ida and Uraraka were arguing about to feign interest. There was nothing interesting to behold, even accidentally. His skull felt like it was caving in. With his ice, he dropped his temperature and wrapped himself in a blanket of frost. Before shutting everyone out, he closed his eyes and greeted the darkness like an old friend. Uniquely grotesque as it was, Shoto always ended up back in the darkness. He wasn't hooked on it, for that required enjoying it, though he couldn't seem to find himself anywhere else. There was the ice that kept him suspended. He wondered what it was like to fall. Shoto's stomach lurched. He was up off the couch in seconds, tripping and stumbling over the goddamn pillows on the ground and only vaguely aware of everyone's concerned attention. "T's fine," Shoto slurred, finding the bathroom and locking himself in. "T's fine, Sho. You're doing good." He collapsed over the toilet, tears pricking his eyes as he hacked and shivered. What little food was inside came out, and he couldn't handle looking at it. "Todoroki, what happened?" Midoriya asked from the other side. "Do you need help? Should I get someone?" Shoto heard the small shuffling from behind the door. "No," he said, now leaning against the bathtub. Whatever words he tried to tell Midoriya wouldn't leave his mouth as a coughing fit racked his body. What the F was going on? "Can I come in? Is that all right?" Shoto grunted, an indicator enough for Midoriya. He closed the door behind him and pointed limply at the space beside Shoto. Shoto nodded and Midoriya sat down. Hey! It's... Shoto felt his jaw unclench in defeat as he drew his legs up to his chest. It's not nothing anymore. Midoriya looked pleading. You should see someone. They can help you get better. Shoto scratched his neck. That was what Sensei had tried telling him, he figured, before Mike Sensei had burst in to overthrow their talk. Todoroki, you're my best friend. He didn't react. He was scared that if he did, he would look worse than crestfallen. But Midoriya brought his own knees up to hug them close, only his eyes visible and peeking over them. You'll never stop being my best friend, but you've stopped being you. He smiled shakily, running his thumb over his palm until it turned white. I'm just kinda scared shitless I'm gonna turn around one day and you'll be gone. He lifted his head again. Can you tell me honestly that you aren't going anywhere? Fuyumi never mentioned anything, Shoto told him. He may have known where it all was leading, but he decided to prolong it for a little bit longer. Right? Yeah, no, that's... Midoriya laughed nervously. Not what I meant. The plastic smile melted and he stared at the ground, passing Shoto only a small glance. I mean, do you plan on leaving? And not coming back even if you wanted to? Do you plan on killing yourself? Shoto tapped the cool tile under his hand. Depends, he said. Midoriya put a hand on his head and closed his eyes. Oh my god, he breathed. Please don't, please, Todoroki, stop thinking about it. Please don't even say that. Shoto turned his head to look at Midoriya, who wasn't even looking back at him, and he realized something. He was a monster. When did his grief turn into everyone else's bane? I'm sorry, Midoriya. I'm really sorry. No, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry that your own mind makes you feel so worthless and hated, and I'm so sorry I never even noticed that someone like you could be hurting so much before you told me anything. I guess I thought that only people like me could feel that way, so I didn't even bother trying to notice. That was kind of the point, though. No one was supposed to know. Shoto shrugged. And now everyone knows. Midoriya released a wavering sigh and Shoto turned away. There was nothing else to say anymore. Shoto was their missing piece, the one that divided all of his friends. Not only had his past returned with sapphire vengeance to swarm him, but it had drenched all of the people around him. He wasn't the only person suffering, but he had been pulled too far down to see that. And they had seen everything. Everything. How could he complain about being powerless when they had to watch him crumble, all while he stopped them from even mentioning it? Come on, Midoriya murmured, grabbing Shoto's hand and pulling him to his feet. You need sleep. This was all a bad idea. Shoto didn't protest, allowing himself to be dragged back to his room by a boy whose warm heart had made him so sad. Tell them I said good night, Shoto said, leaning his hand against the doorframe. Midoriya nodded, folding his arms across his stomach. His shoulders wilted. I will. Good night, Todoroki. Good night, Midoriya. See you in the morning? Shoto exhaled. Yeah. See you in the morning. Endeavor was still out, but Fuyumi and Shoto had already arrived and were making dinner. Do we start without him? Fuyumi said as she stirred, and Shoto knew that she wasn't talking to him. Being back in that house, even for just a day, forced his mouth shut. Memories could be found like mice, hiding behind every corner and in every crack. One room in particular, the one where Shoto and Fuyumi would be cleaning, was infested with those mice. They were to stay for only a few hours and then go right back to UA's iron walls, though because they were in the eye of the storm, Nedza thought it appropriate to have a hero or two stationed outside and waiting, just in case someone showed up. Snipe Sensei and 13 Sensei had volunteered and Shoto peered through the window into the front ear. If Dabi shows up, just focus on getting out as fast as you can. We'll handle the rest. That was what 13 Sensei said as they and Snipe Sensei scritted the siblings back to their own house, the unsafest place they could be. It made Shoto's hand twitch hearing them say that. Reminders of the USJ flooded unpleasantly, where he saw the hero get viscerally ripped in half by their own quirk after standing to defend the young heroes who, realistically, only got in their way. When 13 Sensei turned to look at him, Shoto closed the blinds. Do you know when Endeavor's getting back? He asked while Fuyumi worried in the kitchen. He had made it abundantly clear that he would not be joining them for dinner, which Shoto didn't mind very much. Probably around 10, she snipped back absently, too caught up in her work. It looked like too much, but Shoto didn't say anything about it. He stood up, brushing past Fuyumi and into the hallway. Cold air made his lungs swell painfully, but it was a welcome pain. It was natural pain. He exhaled and watched the cloud of frost leave his mouth. Shoto sat down on the rocks next to the koi pond, leaning down to hover his hand above the still water. The fish had drifted to the bottom already and a sheet of paper-thin ice was forming, easily broken by even the tap of a leaf. He wanted to help push along the course of nature with his ice, but he didn't know if that would harm the koi. Shoto took his hand back. Hey, Shoto, Fuyumi called from the porch. What are you doing out here? Dinner's ready. She smiled as he stalked past her, which he returned with a tilt of his head. Shoto walked into the dining room but he stopped midway, his heart crumbling all over again. Fuyumi, he said quietly. It's just the two of us. The table was set for 3. Oh, Fuyumi slipped by and collected one of the plates, putting it into a cabinet. Sorry. Force of habit. They looked at each other from across the room. Shoto wasn't mad at her. He could never be mad at her, but he had underestimated her. He supposed that he had been too blinded by his own turmoil to see hers. She was better at hiding it. She had more experience, though no one was immune to mistakes. It's okay. Shoto took his seat. As he did, he couldn't help but feel like his limbs were being pulled on strings as he took his share. The kitchen's lights were barely illuminated, allegedly to make it appear that no one was home. Small precautions were the most effective, according to Aizawa-sensei. Even so, Shoto didn't like it. He couldn't see anything in the other rooms very clearly and he designated himself to the far side of the table so that he had a permanent view of his surroundings. He would rather be on edge than too careless. Neither ate very much. Fuyumi bounced her leg on the ground as she pushed the noodles in the bowl around with her chopsticks. Shoto never typically held an appetite, but the circumstances of their visit to the house chased it off in both of them. You're not hungry, are you? Fuyumi asked. Shoto shrugged. You aren't either. They left it there. The curtains lifted because of the breeze that the open windows let through. Both of them preferred the cold whenever they could allow it. Fuyumi stood up with her dishes, rinsing them in the sink and leaving them there for later. She went back and took Shoto's, doing the same and scrubbing at them hard enough to tear pieces of the sponge. Are you okay? Shoto asked, getting to his feet. I'm fine. Why wouldn't I be? You're a bit all over the place. Do you really want to do this tonight? Gotta do it at some point, Shoto. His mouth thinned. He looked over Fuyumi's shoulder into the dark living room and saw nothing hiding in plain sight. He let his breath go. Okay. Fuyumi wiped her hands and beckoned for Shoto to follow her. Come on. They stopped in front of the door. Natsuo's door. Fuyumi turned the knob and pushed it open. It was already rather bare. In the middle were boxes with labels such as clothes and toiletries that had been received from his college dorm room. His girlfriend had delivered them while trying to hide her red-rimmed eyes. Not everything was packed away yet. Empty boxes that were waiting to be filled ridiculed them as they stood still and absorbed the way Natsuo's room was. Shoto wanted to take a photo of it so that he wouldn't forget so soon. He couldn't remember the exact shade of gray that Natsuo's eyes were, whether they were clouds with storms in their bellies or the sea on a leaden morning. The memories were slipping through his hands, the smallest details. The most important ones. Fuyumi took the first step inside. I'll do the closet. You can do the dresser, all right? Shoto nodded, moving to the other side of the room and pulling the drawers open one by one. Every time he grabbed a shirt or pair of briefs, he folded them once, twice, and sometimes a third time if he didn't think it was perfect. He placed them gently in one of the boxes. All of it would be going up to the attic soon where it would collect dust and grime, but he wanted the inside, at the very least, to be clean. As he worked, Shoto found one shirt in particular that he turned over in his hands. The front said front in bold letters, and the back said, predictably, back. He couldn't help himself when he let out a soft laugh as he recalled some of Midoriya's own inane shirts, so similar to this one. He wished that Natsuo and Midoriya could have had more than one tense family dinner together. They would have liked each other, he thought. But he would never know. He wasn't finished with the dresser when Fuyumi stood and told him that she was going to the bathroom. She didn't look at him. He guessed that she was a bit overwhelmed. Shoto drifted towards the closet, crouching to peer into the boxes that Fuyumi had packed. Old DVD containers, jackets, hoodies, even a few books. Shoto picked out the one that caught his attention. It was worn and the pages were beginning to yellow. How to deal with the loss of a loved one. It made sense that Natsuo likely got it when Tuya passed, and as a child with newly found plans to become a doctor, Shoto could imagine him picking up a book with such contents. He flipped through it until he found a dog-eared page. It was the only page that had scribbles and markings on it. The ink from the text was slightly blurred, and it occurred to Shoto that they could have been teardrops. Years in the past, Natsuo had cried over a section in a book, never to find out that his youngest brother would eventually know. The page of the book was one where it encouraged the reader to call the suicide hotline if they were feeling bad enough. Even the number was listed, but Shoto didn't know why he was surprised. He was never taught what the suicide hotline was, let alone that it existed. The number was not one that he was well acquainted with, which he considered strange. Maybe it was common knowledge, and if so, he never stood a chance at recognizing it. Shoto looked around the room before looking back at the book. He ripped the piece of the paper that held the number on it, folding and shoving it into his pocket before slipping the book back where he found it. When Fuyumi returned, Shoto was exactly where she left him, and not a hair was out of place. Shoto heard the car outside and knew that Endeavor had arrived. The footsteps that belonged to his father used to send thunder rolling down his spine. Now, Shoto felt numb, like he should be feeling something, but inexplicably couldn't. He barely looked when the front door opened. Fuyumi greeted him from the kitchen. They were all hollow. "It's good to see you both healthy," Endeavor said as he hung his jacket up on the coat rack. "I'm sorry that our schedules didn't line up very well." "No worries, Dad," Fuyumi said. "Shoto and I practically have the same schedule anyway, so this was fine." That wasn't true. Fuyumi held more free time in her hands than anyone at UA. She was prohibited from returning to work until Tuya was captured, dead or alive. Doubts that Tuya had no qualms about killing children, elementary to college, were non-existent, so it was the safest measure for all parties. "How's school, Shoto?" "Good." Shoto looked over at Fuyumi, perhaps with a bit of malice in his actions. "Curfew is coming up. We should leave soon." Fuyumi turned her phone on to see the time. Her head dipped. "You're right." She gave their father a fatigued smile. "We finished cleaning Natsuo's room. Everything is in the attic now, so you don't have to worry about that anymore." Endeavor coughed into his fist. "Right, of course. Thank you. Both of you. You didn't have to come here." "It wasn't a problem, Dad," Fuyumi said. "We needed closure." Shoto put his hand over his mouth to hide the curl of his lip. None of that was closure, and she knew it as well as he did. Endeavor knew it too. They all wanted closure, but they weren't getting it from anywhere, especially not each other. His mother wasn't getting any closure, locked up in a mental hospital, ostracized and alone, and with only her daughter visiting her. She was barely grieving at all. "Let's go, Shoto." Fuyumi wrapped her scarf over her neck and laced her bag together. "It was good seeing you, Dad. Talk soon." Shoto was going to trail after her immediately, but he hesitated. "Give me a few minutes, Fuyumi, I'll be right out." Fuyumi looked over his shoulder at Endeavor, her face indecipherable. She nodded kindly. "I'll let 13 know." The door closed. Shoto was alone with him. "What do you want to say?" he asked, rubbing his forehead with a heavy hand. "Just say it. It's okay that you'll never forgive me. I don't need permission. Not from you, of all people." Endeavor didn't look strangled. He just looked weary and shriveled, the hero spirit he tried to give Shoto being snuffed out right before his eyes. All of it was nearly a sad sight. Shoto almost felt bad for him. "There's nothing I can do or say to give back what I've taken from you," Endeavor said, hands at his side in his own unusual display of defeat. I know that I'm not a hero you can be proud of, so I hope that you can at least be proud of yourself. Shoto tilted his head and stared. Endeavor was trying, but he would never understand. Not once did I ever need a hero, he said, thinking back to every time he crawled into his mother's lap just to be held and be told that he was loved, even if the people around him told him otherwise. Even if he told himself otherwise. I needed a dad. And you were neither. Shoto shrugged, turning his back and holding onto the door. What else is there to say? His father wouldn't meet his gaze. I'm sorry. Good for you. Do what you want, Endeavor. I don't care anymore, because I don't need you anymore. He pulled the door open, his chest aching as his lungs took in sharp air. I'll never be as kind as Fuyumi is. I'm done. Endeavor said nothing. Shoto closed the door and didn't look back. Fuyumi never asked. She just welcomed him into the car and gave him space. Shoto was lucky to have someone like her. He didn't say that enough. The next morning, Shoto asked Fuyumi to sign him out of the building. He was beginning to push his luck, leaving UA 2 days in a row, but he needed to find out what closure did look like. There was no guarantee that Rei would be the answer to that. He kept his hopes to a minimum. She was delicate, her mind even more so. Fuyumi fretted. She asked if that was a good idea or if she should go with him and what prompted such a question. Shoto turned the scrap of paper in his pocket, now carrying it around like it meant something. I want to go alone, he said. Now, though, standing in front of her hospital door, he could feel the regret boiling in his stomach. All too suddenly, he wanted someone to hold his hand and squeeze it tight. He wanted his mother, but she was who he wanted comfort from. He forced his fears down and wrapped the door. Silence. That scared him the most. Chills wrapped around his limbs and whispered in his ears that if he opened the door, he would find Rei dead on the ground. Keep it closed and she would be fine. He could turn around and walk away as if it never happened. But then he wouldn't be able to see his mother. Swallowed as the door creaked open. Icicles punctured his head and his heart as he soaked in the state of it all. The shelves were tucked in neatly and the letters that she usually kept with her were nowhere in sight. Hidden. Taken away. Thrown out. Bile in his mouth couldn't be pushed down. Mom? He said softly. Rei's hair was in knots but her clothes were fresh and ironed, a weak facade provided by the hospital staff that she wasn't bothering to amp in. When she moved her head around to face him, her eyes cut straight through. They looked disconnected and wasted, shades darker than he remembered them. My son is dead, she murmured. Her voice was monotone yet frail. Shoto felt his breath ride up in his throat as he stared at her. She had never sounded more like a mother. I'm sorry, he whispered. My son is dead, she repeated. He's gone. Fuyumi didn't know. If she knew, she would have told him. If she knew, she wouldn't have let him visit at all, or insisted to a greater extent that she go with him. Surely she didn't know that Rei realized Natsuo was dead. She would have told him. Rei stood up cautiously. Shoto still flinched. She was going to crack. Even if she wasn't shivering on the phone while hysterically whispering about him, he knew how this ended. Shoto should have run. He felt like he was making the same mistake twice. When she approached him, he wanted to put his hands up to protect his face. The screaming of the kettle burned his ears. He was terrified of what she could do, what she might do, to him. She could crack his head against the wall. She could score his eyes. She could dig her nails into his scar and tear it down his face on account of seeing too much of Tuya in him. She could do any of it and he would let her. His mother put her cold hands on his arms. She hugged him. You took so long, she said into his shirt. I thought you were dead too. He could hear his breath quiver. If he closed his eyes, he was back in the kitchen and stumbling to get away from her. He kept them open and felt like her touch locked him in place. I'm okay, he said, but he didn't raise his arms to hug her back. He didn't know if he was saying it to soothe her or himself. Shoto didn't know if it was an accident or her instinct, but her grip around him tightened. She needed a lifeline and Shoto could barely be his own. He stepped away, carefully brushing her off. Rei's hands were on her chest and she watched him. Sorry. I'm sorry, Mom. Did you not know either? Is that why you didn't visit? Shoto's neck turned downward to hide his face. I knew, before anyone else did. He knew that blood dripped faster down someone's face when tears helped pull them along. He knew that Natsuo couldn't remember the last time he saw his little brother cry and what an out-of-breath laugh sounded like. He knew what it was like to want to scream into someone's arms but be too catatonic to even speak. He knew that when someone died, they didn't look like they were sleeping. They were struggling and tearing up and fighting to stay alive, but when they finally gave in, they looked so sad. Ray didn't know what that was like to see. How desperate someone becomes in those final lonely moments that they're willing to smile with anyone they can, even if they should hate the person they find, because they will trust anyone to help them. He wanted to live. Shoto? Are you all right? Shoto looked at his mother and heard the piercing whistle and his own screeching pleas. This was a mistake, he said. I didn't know. I'm sorry, Mom, I'm sorry. I can't do this. Wait, tell me what's wrong. Let me fix this. You can't. It's my fault, not yours. Shoto faltered away, fumbling with the knob under his hands. I love you, I do. But, he swung the door open, tightening his fists so that they wouldn't shake. I'm sorry. He closed the door on her face, walking through the hall and covering his face with a blue paper mask he picked up on a table. Nurses gave him confused looks, but he moved past them and through the lobby. The woman at the desk who he normally thanked on his way out tried to talk to him. He ignored her too, and fled the hospital, staggering into present Mike Sensei's car. The face mask was off with a violent rip that snapped the ear straps. I ruined it, Shoto said. His brain couldn't articulate anything else other than the blatant. I ruined all of it. Mike Sensei's brows arched forward. Whoa kid, slow down there. Can you tell me what's going on? Shoto jerked away from his teacher's grasp, but he didn't slow down. He scratched at the back of his hand. She knows. She realized she remembered. I don't know, but she knows Natsuo's dead. Can you take a deep breath for me, kiddo? In through the nose, out through the mouth. Mike Sensei did it, for example. Come on, you got this. Shoto did as he was told and shakily inhaled, choking down hiccups and never meeting Mike Sensei's swirled eyes. There you go. Now follow my finger, K? Breathe in when I go up, out when I go down. I'll do it with you. A different method that Shoto wasn't accustomed to. Mike held up his palm and slowly outlined it with his finger. Shoto tried to match his breathing like he was ordered to, but he messed up the rhythm and pulled back. I can't. I'm sorry. Shoto put his head in his hand and raked at his hair. Not a problem, Todoroki. This'll pass. Just hang in there. You're doing good, kid. His lungs were too big. He couldn't get enough air in them even when his shoulders heaved with effort. The sounds he made were hoarse and dry, and he wanted to bang his hand against the window until it broke and glass shattered underneath his skin and in his veins. Shoto drummed his fingers on top of his head, counting each one under his breath. Can we leave? He croaked, keeping his face forward on the dashboard. Do you want to talk about it? Mike Sensei asked, his voice almost dropping away. Shoto stared out the window at the hospital. He couldn't see his mother's room from the angle they were parked at. The number in his pocket was a weight that he was far too aware of. I just want to go. He wanted to add home. He didn't think he could. You wanted to see me? Shoto stared across the office at Principal Nedzu, Aizo-sensei, and Fuyumi. The principal was smiling in a way that made Shoto want to put armor on and keep his distance. He didn't think it was on purpose. That was just how he happened to look, but Shoto didn't appreciate the company he had called in. Sensei and Fuyumi glanced at each other, then at Shoto, who tilted his head forward, slowly reaching to pull up a chair at Nedzu's request. Fuyumi refused to look at him for too long. What is this? He asked. Thank you for coming on such short notice, Todoroki, Nedzu said with a friendly twitch of his nose, not ignoring what he had said, but pretending no one had said anything at all. Shoto didn't reciprocate the insulting smile, instead waiting for Nedzu to stop sugarcoating whatever he wanted to say. How was your visit to your mother? Shoto stopped, moving his hand to cover his face as he watched Nedzu. That was a mere few hours ago and he already knew. Truthfully, if Shoto had Bakugo's level of self-control and he wasn't surrounded by heroes, he would have made the principal show him if he had claws underneath those mittens. But Shoto was not Bakugo, so he kept his features neutral and unfazed, no matter how untrue it was. What dawned on him was the amount of information that Nezu could have on every moment Shoto spent in UA since his return. Knowledge of every freakout and plunge could be hidden behind those forever calculating eyes that held far too much information to keep any normal human sane. Though, Nezu wasn't human, was he? Shoto pulled back from his anger, fully realizing the situation he could potentially be in. Expulsion, suspension, or getting sent home. Those were the options that came to mind. Aizawa-sensei had told Nezu about their conversations, and Mike-sensei had certainly told him about Shoto's breakdown outside the hospital. He wasn't stable enough to continue at UA, is what Nezu would tell him. The visit was fine, Shoto said coldly. Nezu's friendliness didn't waver, but he closed his eyes and shifted his head. I hear from your teachers that your performance in academics has been dropping, though your skill in training has been quite consistent. Am I being punished? Shoto tried to ask. Is that why my sister is here? No, Fuyumi and Aizawa-sensei said in unison, but only one of them kept tapping their foot against the carpet. Aizawa-sensei continued for both of them. Ned's right, kid, and to put it in the simplest terms, we're concerned. Why? I'm the one who asked for this meeting, Shoto, Fuyumi told him. Shoto furrowed his eyebrows, sitting up a bit straighter. She bit the inside of her lip. After what you said in my room about, and what Eraserhead said about your hand, and what Present Mike told me about, I thought that this would be best. I didn't want to wait and let you destroy yourself when there were so many chances to step in and do something. So, we're doing something, Sensei finished. You told him. Shoto tossed his head at Nezu while glaring at Fuyumi, who didn't shrink back, but she looked like she wanted to. She always looked like she wanted to. It was a cumulative response to observation, Nezu interjected. He was ignored. Fuyumi threw her hands up. What was I supposed to do? I don't know, let me figure it out? Shoto scowled, rubbing at the bridge of his nose. I can clean up my own messes, especially when I'm the mess. She didn't bother to look at him after that, just staring at the table as she rested her chin on her palm. You were getting worse, I was getting worried, and you visiting Mom after weeks of saying you wouldn't was my last straw. I needed to do something, because words just never get through to you the same way action does. Shoto leaned back in his chair with a thump. He didn't have the strength to sit up. He craned his neck back to look at the ceiling. Nezu clasped his paws together. This is a good thing, Todoroki, I can assure you. We'll get you the help that you need. He brought his head back down when slick pain began to rub the back of his skull. He was being spoken to like he was a festering patient in a medical facility. Nezu may as well have been reading off of a manual with his empty, degrading words. Shoto glanced at Fuyumi, who was still looking at the wall. She was trying so hard, he could tell. He was the one who kept making things difficult for her. Shoto entertained Nezu's offer for her sake. What does that look like? He mumbled. I'm glad you asked. Nezu beamed and didn't elaborate further. Sensei cleared his throat. We have no control over what you choose to do in your personal time. However, if you don't provide proof that you're seeing a licensed therapist or psychologist at least once a week, then UA is requiring you to spend 30 minutes every Friday talking to the guidance counselor, Hound Dog. Is that really my choice? Shoto let his fingers curl against his cheek. It was the only sourness he allowed to leak through and put on display in front of people with much more power than him. Nezu's ears flicked against his head. If I may, Todoroki, he purred. Does having your sister in the room with us prevent you from telling the truth? The truth seemed like a rather bold assumption, even for Principal Nezu. Fuyumi knew the truth far better than he did. She knew things about him that Nezu never would. Fuyumi still didn't turn her head, but her shoulders loosened and her head was dipped. She was never mad for very long, if she was ever mad at all. Shoto knew how central Fuyumi was to his life. She was the one who helped raise him after Rei had to leave, ensuring that he knew what a real mother's touch should have felt like. Fuyumi must have known that she could never replicate Rei, but she walked around in shoes too big for her anyway. Perhaps it was the intimacy that they held that kept Shoto quiet. He never wanted to disappoint her. Perhaps Nezu was right. I don't know, Shoto said. Maybe. Sensei nodded, inclining his head towards Fuyumi and lacing his fingers together. Would it be a problem if you stepped outside for a few moments? Not at all, Fuyumi said, pushing her chair back. She smiled down at Shoto and almost tapped his arm, a small gesture of comfort. She stopped, dropping her hand and nodding again. She was disappointed. Shoto knew she was. She thought that progress had been made, and Shoto had thought so as well, but he couldn't do it. Speaking to others about his problems with her next to him locked his jaw in a way he couldn't explain. Now, Sensei said, between the two options we gave you, which would you prefer? If you don't have an answer, that's fine. We don't need one yet. You're free to discuss all of this with your sister once we're finished here. Shoto scratched under his scar, blinking. When Midoriya had come to him to express his feelings of needing a therapist, Shoto had been supportive of the decision. He was fairly certain that a majority of his classmates spoke with some type of professional, both outside and inside of school. Once Shoto was finally asked if he was seeing a therapist, he remembered feeling undivided offense at the concept. Turning the idea on himself made him bury his nails into his palms and see stars. A part of him, the kinder part, felt that whoever got stuck with Shoto would be in over their head. He had too much to ever be taken on willingly. He didn't need to know what kind of face the person sitting across from him on uncomfortable chairs would make once they found out that Shoto was the reason Dabi existed. Not to mention everything else. God, there was so much. He didn't have time to dump every problem in his life onto an outsider. No one could be compensated enough for that. Regardless, he didn't need a therapist. The concept alone was laughable. Shoto Todoroki, prodigal son of the #1 hero, walking into a therapist's office and forfeiting his privacy. That was a joke. He didn't need a stranger picking apart his brain and telling him what he already knew, that he was unfixable and irredeemable. Shoto halted in his tracks. He would spend the rest of his life like this. With painful rasps of breath and bones too big for his body, none of it would get better. Somehow, he had forgotten about the ice that strung him in between. Somehow, he had forgotten that his future was already dead. Hound dog, Shoto murmured, pulling his hand away from his face. I'll see hound dog. The permanent smile on Nedzu's face wasn't permanent anymore. It tightened before dropping completely. Wrong choice, his brain supplied against his volition. Nedzu shuffled paper on his desk. Shoto looked only at Aizawa-sensei. Would he say anything? Would he tell him that he was making the worst decision of his life? Shoto hoped that he would, but he didn't know why. Sensei's arms were folded over his chest. It didn't look disapproving. He didn't look much of anything. If that's what you want, we'll set it all up. You're free to go, Todoroki. Send your sister back in when you leave. Yes, sir. Shoto stood, leaning into a bow before slipping free from Nedzu's office. Fuyumi was waiting by the door, playing with her phone. When he emerged, she stopped and put it away. So, they want you in there again, Shoto told her. I'm going back to the dorms. She nodded, rubbing her hand up and down her arm. I'll see you later, then Shoto. And, she tapped his forearm as she passed him, a small, warm smile unfurling on her face. I'm proud of you. Shoto took a step back, anxiety and discomfort making it hard to look at her. I know, Fuyumi. He stopped, shaking his head. I'll see you later. Fuyumi let him go, and when Shoto reached the end of the hallway, he turned around once, to see her enter the principal's office. He sighed. You'll be all right. And she would be, even if she didn't agree at first. She just wouldn't be getting the chance to argue. Fuyumi was never mad for very long. It was night now, and Shoto finally left his room to visit the lounge. Eri was sitting attentively on the couch when he entered, snuggled under Mirio's arm and watching the television with her youthful fervor. An animated children's show was playing, one he couldn't recognize, but both Mirio and Kirishima seemed to be enjoying it just as much as she was. Shoto smiled like chipped paint when Eri lifted her head to say hello, even laughing softly when she sprang from the couch to hug his waist. Did you beat the monster? She asked. He pet his head to the side. What monster? The one that took your brother away. Did you beat it? Eri's eyes were wide, yet not water-filled. You must have. You know how to smile. Shoto breathed, staring down at her. Yeah. He crouched to her level and picked his hand up, reaching out to ruffle the top of her head. I think so. He had made his choice. How the others viewed it would determine its worth. Once he looked back up, he caught Kirishima turning his head away. It was odd seeing his face so indecipherable. The boy was typically never reluctant to allow his emotions to bleed onto his sleeves. When Shoto was noticed, his sharp grin was back on his face. Have you ever seen this one before? Shoto moved further into the lounge, peering at the television screen. The animation style was simple and aesthetically chosen, but there wasn't much else to say about it. He wasn't familiar with the concept or title. I haven't, he replied. You should watch it at some point, Mirio chimed in. It's pretty good for a kid's show. Shoto shrugged, watching fondly as Eri jumped back onto the couch. At some point maybe, when I have time. Kirishima tightened the headband around his forehead. You going somewhere? Do you know where Bakugo is? Shoto asked instead. He could find the others with relative ease. Bakugo was more sporadic, spending time in every corner the school had to offer. Not even the library was safe from his wrath. He's in his room. Kirishima gave him a curious look. What are you up to, dude? It was a very innocent question and asked in that manner, but Shoto's words dried up fast. He put a hand in his pocket and scratched at his palm. Nothing. I want to ask him about some homework. Kirishima didn't appear fully convinced, but he allowed the exchange to come to a close and Shoto said goodbye to Eri. Her smile wrapped his heart in tinsel and he waved quietly, stalking into the hallway. He kept his footsteps light, building the nerves up in his chest. The more he thought about it, the more people he felt he owed an apology to. To the people he had wronged, such as Bakugo, Inesa, and Ida. To the people he had failed, Midoriya, Aizawa-sensei, and Fuyumi. To the people he was leaving behind, like Eri, Rei, the whole of Class 1. How would they take it? He pictured them to be devastated, but what if they were glad? What if they were finally able to shake off that thorn in their side? Shoto wasn't only doing it for himself. He wanted them to be okay as well. He approached Bakugo's door, coughing through sandpaper that coated his throat. He knocked. It took a moment, but Bakugo opened it with a grumble and pricked a brow up. Well, that's new, he muttered with an unimpressed scan of Shoto. The hell do you want? I came to apologize, he said, drumming his fingers against the back of his neck. Yeah, sure. Bakugo almost laughed, but it sounded more like a guttural bark. What do you really want? Shoto held back a sigh. I'm telling the truth. You remember the courtyard? I never apologized for what I said about All Might. That thing I said to you Bakugo scoffed, holding up a hand before Shoto could continue. Yeah, cool it, I remember now. He sighed, running his hand through his hair. Like I was ever going to say anything. It was effed up, sure, but you were also kinda. I don't know. You were effed up too. It's not an excuse. Dean, right, it's not, but do I look bothered right now? You looked bothered when I said it. Bakugo made an exasperated noise, glaring at Shoto. Okay, listen, icy hot. You want to just drop it and move on? I'm giving you so many outs right now, but you're too dense to see him. If you want. I just came to apologize. So apologize. Right, sorry. I'm sorry for what I said. Yeah, I forgive you or whatever. They're happy? Shoto shrugged. He didn't feel very happy, but despair was a faraway whisper in his mind. Red eyes bore into his, not exactly waiting for a response. Bakugo glanced down as Shoto stepped away from the door. He could have heard a faint skip in breath, but it may have been a figment of imagination. The F is up with your hand? Shoto watched him. Your hand? Why does it look like you threw it palms up on a chopping board? Shoto tilted his head to the side, examining it. Beads of red dotted the scratches and he winced at himself. He must have used his quirk without knowing, marking the skin worse than he would have with just his nails. He activated his right side and watched ice crawl onto his knuckles and joints, cooling the wounds sufficiently. Ice wasn't the cure for every injury, but Shoto found that it certainly helped with a lot of things. Hatred for his father wasn't the only reason he had refused to use his fire so long ago. His right was simply more efficient than his left, and much more appealing to look at. With his hand numb and treated, Shoto looked blankly back up at Bakugo. It's fine. No need to worry. Shoto tried to walk away, but Bakugo stopped him. Wait. Shoto waited. In the short months that he had known Bakugo, he had rarely seen him look so uneasy. In a formidable style true to him, he came out and asked without much build-up. Todoroki. Are you okay? Wondering aloud, such a provocative yet bland question must be new to him. Saying it directly to the subject's face, an even greater challenge. Bakugo was nothing if not determined, however, a trait that still continued to cause problems for Shoto. Yes, I'm fine. They're just scratches. Bakugo had an explosion of choice words he wanted to say to him, Shoto could tell. A crimson ocean of anger and self-righteousness that had plagued him since the first day at UA was returning with the high tide, staring Shoto in the face now. Don't do anything effing stupid, Todoroki, Bakugo scowled at last. I gotta beat you and Deku for that #1 spot after we get out of here. Shoto was honored that he was still considered part of the opposition. Best of luck, then. Yes, Bakugo would be perfectly fine. That was one less competitor out of the way for him to taste gold. He would get over it in good time. I need to go. Homework, Shoto said. He slid from Bakugo's verbal confinements, waving as the door closed in Shoto's face. Had he insulted Bakugo again? That was beginning to become a horrible streak. There was nothing more he could do, so he left. It happened to be fate's terrible and perfect wish for Shoto to meet up with Midoriya and Yaoyorozu at that same moment as he was heading back to his dorm room. It worked in funny ways like that. Up to anything special, Todoroki? Yaoyorozu asked, adjusting the pile of books in her arms. Midoriya had a textbook and his regular notebook, pen in hand like a key. No, nothing. What about you? Midoriya flipped through his notes, showing him a new page of a certain winged hero. Can you believe I haven't updated his page yet? I mean, of course I updated it when I met him, but it's always time for a revamp. And I, Yaoyorozu said, carefully showing him one of the books, am trying to memorize more compounds. I'm going to work on being more creative with my quirk. Can't rely on you to pick me up whenever I get down, now can I? He returned her teasing smile with a sheepish one of his own. I guess not. Hey, you want to join us? Midoriya asked, creasing a page in his notes and tucking his pen inside as he closed it. It might be a little boring, but you're totally invited. Shoto shook his head. I'm tired. I think I'm going to stay in my room for the night. I appreciate it, though I do. Yaoyorozu rolled her shoulders, keeping the books balanced. She was going to be sore from carrying so much weight, especially if they were coming from the library. The walk was one of the longest on campus. Oh, I hope you get some sleep, she said. Don't be afraid to stop by if you're feeling up to it. Shoto agreed with no intention of ever stopping by, but he wasn't lying about his appreciation. Their kindness was a quality he thought highly of. Midoriya and Yaoyorozu worked well together, he concluded. Yaoyorozu held more smarts than Midoriya in academics, but she loved answering questions. They were the perfect study partners. Shoto couldn't have intruded on that. Their goodbyes to each other were abrupt yet sincere. Shoto arrived back at his room and entered, letting go of his anchored breath. His legs wanted to buckle underneath him, but he worked his way over to the bed and sat down. Shoto put his head in his hands and knotted his hair, pressing deeply into his eyes until they throbbed and he couldn't see, even when he opened them. That was it. Shoto had said his goodbyes and would not be turning around anymore. The last time he had was when a purple and swollen hand latched onto his collar in a festival arena and ripped him from his foggy mind, forcing him to remember what he was truly fighting for. Now, he couldn't help but feel it was what started that chain of events down a blackened and marred road, right into Tuya's patient hand. Did Tuya want Shoto to accept his power as his own? Had he known that that would cause Shoto so much more pain than if Midoriya had never bothered with him? To think, Midoriya hardly saw Endeavor's son that day, but someone who looked like he needed saving. It was ludicrous and comforting and an insult to his face, and did Shoto ever thank him for that? He didn't move his hands, but he laughed just underneath them. Rei would adore Midoriya. He hoped that Fuyumi would take him to meet her. He should write a note and ask her to do that someday. The three of them, sharing tea and stories and plans for the future. He wanted them to be happy. They would be happy. He just wouldn't be there to see it. It bothered him, almost, that he couldn't have what most took for granted. He wanted a whole family, not fragments of what may have been. He wanted to feel happy, not an imitation of it. Surviving wasn't enough. He wanted to live. Shoto broke his hand away from his face, glaring at it. With stiff fingers, he watched claws of ice grow steadily. He clicked them together with a faraway look before breaking one off and holding it like a knife. There was no pretty way to do it. If he sliced his throat open, he would suffocate after gargling his own blood as it spilled onto the floor and out of his mouth. He didn't know if he had enough strength in his arms to slit the other wrist, either. Looking up online how to properly kill himself seemed crude. If anyone was monitoring their internet use, he would set off every alarm in the building and be shipped off to a mental ward before he could even get the chance to follow the instructions. He could tie a noose and hang himself, but when he imagined someone finding him dangling from the ceiling, he felt his stomach twist. What if Fuyumi was the one that found him? In her life, it would be his one last failure. An overdose, then, but where would he get the pills? Did any of his classmates keep them in the bathroom cabinets, or did they bring them back to their rooms when they finished? None of it was going right. Shoto wanted to shout, hitting the blankets next to him with a closed fist. Think, Shoto, think. He was trying to figure out a painless way to commit suicide, like he somehow deserved that. Tuya hadn't died painlessly. Natsuo had been in agony in his final moments. Even with those memories printed into him, Shoto couldn't help but be selfish. He slid off of the bed, positioning himself against its leg and opening his arm up. He pressed the ice onto a blue vein at the base of his wrist. Down and out. That was all he needed to do. Switch hands and repeat. After that, he would be done. It would all be over. Shoto tried to steel his thawing nerves. The prospect of everything ending at once rocked him more than it should have. With his heart finally in his grasp, he couldn't stifle its beating. Down and out, one fluid motion. A training exercise, he tried to think of it as. It didn't matter that he was letting Tuya win. Shoto would win too, because he wouldn't have to live in a world with that demon. Let him have endeavor, he didn't care. Let him have it all. Let their house go up in flames and let everything inside burn with it. Shoto didn't care. Fuyumi would cry. She would freeze over and read another eulogy, choking down her tears and staring too long at the casket before continuing. Rei would scream. Or she would go white. She would deny Shoto's death until it found her, alone and without her sons. He didn't know if she would go to his funeral. He didn't know what endeavor would do. Blame himself, probably, which sounded strange no matter how true it may have been. Retirement was already inching closer. Tuya would laugh. That made Shoto bare his teeth and squeeze his eyes shut. He would find it all so hilarious in that mad glee he loved showing off. He would brag about it to his friends, the League. Shoto would have loved to be in that room, just so he could kick their jaws for daring to put his name in their mouths. His classmates would think him a coward for running away so soon. He wouldn't blame them for that. He agreed. Shoto wanted to see the koi pond one last time. To dip his hand in the chill water and see the fish, the ones that didn't have names, but could have, in some other life. You don't want to die. Fuyumi's voice was an echo in his head. He stared at his hand that held the ice, trembling, but still held against his wrist. The skin was pale and ready to break, and it would if he pressed down any harder. You want to be okay. He had lied to Eri, right through his teeth. There was no monster, not one that he could vanquish into the depths of hell. Midoriya was special. Or maybe he was just the luckiest BSTRD Shoto ever met. No, that title was reserved for Bakugo, who never knew when the hell to stop. Shoto saw him launch into the air just to get stabbed through nearly every limb and muscle, and he still lived. He was still the same. How did they do it? Why couldn't Shoto be blessed with that same luck? If they weren't blessed with it, then they had created it. Shoto didn't even know how to do that. He thought he wanted to learn. The ice fell from his hand and clattered on the floor, but Shoto didn't move. He breathed out, feeling the frosted mist touch his cheeks and brush against his hair. With nothing going through his head, Shoto pulled his phone out and dialed a number. He held it up to his ear and counted every second he heard it ring. Hours must have gone by. The automated message didn't surprise him. He let it talk and didn't listen to a word. Finally, he heard a voice. A person speaking to him. Clouds drifted through his vision. He was barely awake for it. "Hello," a woman on the other end said. She had a nice tone. He wanted to melt into it. Shoto put his head back against the bed. He was tired of fighting. He was tired of it all. He didn't want to leave. Not yet. Not yet. Until then, he would survive. "Hello." Shoto swallowed. "I need help. Please."